She dropped her suitcase in the snow and said out loud to no one, "I've made the worst mistake of my life." Margaret Hale had crossed 2,000 miles to marry a man she'd fallen in love with through 11 letters. And there he stood on the Cheyenne platform, bearded, mud-caked, eating out of a paper sack with his bare hands. Her whole body wanted to turn and buy a ticket home. If you love stories about second chances and the men who prove us wrong, subscribe and follow this to the very end. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story travels. The train had barely stopped shuddering before Margaret Hale knew. She had rehearsed this moment for 6 weeks. On the long ride out of Boston through Chicago, through the flat brown, nothing of Nebraska, she had built the picture in her mind, the way a woman builds a house she intends to live in for the rest of her life. Caleb Morgan would be waiting on the platform. He would be exactly as he'd been in the photograph he mailed inside the 4th letter. Dark hair combed back, a clean jaw, a straight collar, eyes that looked like they'd read every book she had. He would step forward. He would say her name like it meant something. And she, Margaret Hale, twice left at the altar, twice called, too difficult, too sharp, too much, would finally have proof that a mind could love a mind, and that she had not been a fool to believe it. That was the picture. Then the porter opened the door, and the cold came in like a slap, and she came down the iron steps holding her hat against the wind, and she saw him. Or she saw a man. She did not yet believe it was him. He was standing near the freight end of the platform, with his weight on one hip, a battered hat pushed back off his forehead, and a full brown beard that had clearly not met a razor in a month. His coat was gray with age, torn at one elbow, so the wool lining showed through like a wound. His boots were caked to the ankle in dried mud, the color of old blood. And in one large hand, he held a crumpled paper sack, and out of that sack, he was at this exact moment pulling a fistful of something jerky or dried meat and putting it into his mouth with his fingers. Margaret stopped at the bottom of the steps. Please, she thought, not him. Any man on this platform but him. He looked up. Their eyes met across 30 feet of frozen boards, and something in the way his shoulders shifted, the way he crumpled the sack shut and tucked it into his coat, told her before he took a single step. It was him. Her suitcase slipped out of her gloved fingers and thumped down into a gray crust of old snow. She heard herself breathe out a small sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob, and she said it quietly to the cold air and to nobody. I've made the worst mistake of my life. He crossed the platform toward her. He did not hurry. That was the first thing she noticed, and hated the unhurried way he moved, like a man who had never once in his life needed to convince anyone of anything. He stopped in front of her, took off his hat with one hand, and held out the other. Miss Hale, he said. His voice was low and even. Caleb Morgan. Reckon you had a long ride. She looked at the hand. It was a large hand scarred across 2 knuckles, the nails clean, but the skin cracked from cold and work. Nothing in 11 letters had prepared her for that hand. For one full second, she considered not taking it. She considered saying, "There has been a mistake, sir, and I will be returning to Boston on the next eastbound train, and I thank you for your correspondence." She had the sentence fully formed. She had, God knew, plenty of practice ending things. Instead, her manners drilled into her by a dead mother across 29 years betrayed her, and she put her hand into his and shook it once. "Mr. Morgan," she said. His grip was firm and warm and dry, and it was over in a moment, and he bent and picked up her fallen suitcase before she could reach for it herself. "You've got a trunk in the baggage car." "A trunk?" "Yes." Her voice came out thinner than she wanted. "I'll fetch it. Wagon's out front. It's cold. You go on and sit inside the depot. I'll not be long." And he turned and walked off toward the baggage car with her suitcase in his hand, leaving her standing on the platform in her good traveling coat, in her good hat, with her whole life packed into one trunk and one bag, both of them now in the hands of a stranger who ate jerky out of a paper sack with his fingers. Margaret did not go inside the depot. She stood exactly where she was, and she watched him go, and she thought about the letters. The letters had been the most alive she'd felt in years. She could not deny that even now, even furious, even sick with disappointment. It had begun with the advertisement 4 lines in the back of a matrimonial paper her friend Cora had left on the sideboard as a cruel little joke. Rancher seeks a wife who can think. Beauty optional. Conversation required. Wyoming territory. She had read it 3 times. She had told herself she was only answering it to prove a point, though what the point was or to whom she could not have said. Her first letter had been 4 pages of near insult. She had informed the anonymous rancher that any man who advertised for a thinking wife was likely a man who had never met one, that beauty optional was a phrase designed to attract the desperate and reassure the plain, and that she personally was plain opinionated 29 and had been left at the altar not once but twice by men who claimed to admire her mind right up until the moment they had to live beside it. She had signed it, M. Hale, and mailed it fully expecting never to hear back, and rather enjoying the thought of some Wyoming brute reading it and choking on his coffee. 11 days later, a reply came. Miss Hale, it read. I've read your letter 4 times. The first time it made me angry. The second time it made me laugh. The third and fourth times I copied out 3 of your sentences and pinned them above my desk because they're truer than anything I've read in a year of the Denver papers. You say you're plain. I've buried a wife, and I've buried a partner, and I've watched a good horse die under me in a river crossing. And I've learned there's not one thing on this earth that matters less than what a face looks like. You ask what I want. I want somebody I can argue with over supper and still want to talk to in the morning. If that frightens you, don't write back. If it doesn't tell me what you make of a man who runs 300 head of cattle and reads Marcus Aurelius by lamplight, and can't for the life of him decide if the 2 things fit together. Yours, C. Morgan. She had written back that same night. For 11 letters they had argued. He held that a man's worth was in what he could endure. She held it was in what he could imagine. He knew cattle prices and rail rates and the exact acreage a cow needed to survive a Wyoming winter, and he laid it all out in a plain hand that never once condescended to her. She knew books and Boston and the way a drawing room could kill a person by inches, and he asked her real questions about all of it. And when she answered, he answered back, and he never, not one single time in 11 letters, told her she was too much. That was the thing. That was the exact thing. 2 men had told her she was too much. Her father had told her near the end that if she'd only learned to hold her tongue, she might have been married by 20 and spared him the worry. And here was a stranger in Wyoming, a man she had never seen, telling her across 2,000 miles that her tongue was the most interesting thing about her. She had fallen in love with that. She could admit it now, standing frozen on the Cheyenne platform. She had fallen in love with a hand that wrote well, and she had dressed that hand up in the borrowed face from the photograph, and she had gotten on a train. And the hand had been real, and the photograph had been a lie. Or not a lie exactly, but 10 years old and taken by a traveling man in a town 200 miles east, back before whatever it was that had put those lines around his eyes and that beard on his face and that tear in his coat. She was still standing there thinking all of this when he came back with her trunk on one shoulder like it weighed nothing. You didn't go in, he said. It wasn't quite a question. No. He looked at her for a moment. He had gray eyes, she noticed, against her own will. Not the dark eyes of the photograph. Gray and steady, and there was something moving behind them that she couldn't read and didn't want to. You're free to go in, Miss Hale, he said. Or you're free to get on the next train east. I'll not stop you. I'll pay your fare back, and we'll call it a lesson learned by mail. No hard feelings on my side. He set the trunk down. But it's 40 below by nightfall, and the eastbound doesn't come through till Thursday. So one way or the other, you'll want to be somewhere warm by dark. My wagon's warm. There's a stove at the ranch. That's all I'm offering. The rest is yours to decide. She stared at him. It would have been easier, she thought, if he'd been cruel. If he'd been the brute she'd built in her head in the last 5 minutes, she could have hated him cleanly and left. Instead, he stood there in his torn coat and offered her the honest truth and a way out, and did not once beg, and did not once pretend to be anything other than exactly what he was, and she found that she did not have a single sentence prepared for a man like that. Thursday, she said. Thursday. She looked past him at the depot, small and gray, and past that at the town, small and gray, and past that at the country, which went on brown and white and empty, to a horizon so far away, it made her chest hurt. 2,000 miles behind her was Boston, where she was too difficult. Ahead of her was a stranger with a torn coat. "I'll ride to the ranch," she heard herself say. "For tonight. I make no promises past that." Something moved in his face. Not a smile, just an easing around the eyes. "That's fair," he said. "That's more than fair. Come on then, wagons this way." The wagon was a plain buckboard with 2 rough-coated horses in the traces and a heap of blankets on the seat. He handed her up with the same firm, brief courtesy, climbed up beside her, tucked a heavy wool blanket over her lap without comment, and clicked his tongue, and the horses leaned into the cold, and the town of Cheyenne began to slide away behind them. For the first mile, neither of them spoke. Margaret sat with her hands folded under the blanket and her jaw set and composed in her head the letter she would send Cora. "Dear Cora," she began, "you will be delighted to learn that your little joke has borne fruit. I have traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man who eats out of a paper bag and dresses like a scarecrow that lost a fight. I return Thursday. Do not say a word." She was 3 sentences into the imaginary letter when Caleb Morgan spoke. "Hawk," he said. She turned. "I beg your pardon." He lifted his chin toward the sky ahead of them, where a dark shape hung nearly motionless against the pale gray. "Rough-legged hawk. Come down from the north for the winter. You can tell by how it hovers. Red tail don't hover like that, it soars. This one'll hang in one spot in the wind watching for mice under the snow." He said it plainly, the way another man might mention the time. "They breed up on the tundra in summer, then come down here where it's warm, if you can feature that. This being what they call warm." Margaret looked at the hawk. It hung in the sky exactly as he'd said, wings trembling, holding one patch of air against the wind by sheer will. "How do you know that?" she said. It came out flatter than she meant. "Watched 'em." "That's not knowing. That's noticing." He glanced at her, and there was that easing around the eyes again, almost a smile, and not quite. "All right," he said. "Fair. I read it in a book first. Fella named Coos wrote up all the birds of the West. I sent to Denver for it. Then I watched to see was he right. He was right about the hawk." He clicked to the horses. "Wrong about the sage grouse, though, or I've got the only lying grouse in the territory." And Margaret Hale, against every intention she had, felt the corner of her mouth twitch. She caught it. She smoothed her face flat again and looked away at the brown country going by. But he'd seen it. She was almost sure he'd seen it, and she was furious at herself, and she said nothing. A mile later, he pointed out a low ridge to the south, a spine of pale rock breaking through the snow. "That's the old seabed," he said. "This whole country was under water once. Ocean. You dig into that ridge, you'll find shells. Little curled ones like a ram's horn. Ammonites, the book calls them. Been dead 100 million years, and they're just sitting up there in the rock waiting on you to notice." "Underwater," she repeated despite herself. "All of it. Every mile you rode in on was a sea." He shook his head slowly. "Makes a man feel small thinking on it. Which I figure is good for a man. Most of what's wrong with people is they don't feel small often enough." Margaret turned and looked at him fully, then for the first time since the platform, really looked. And she saw the torn coat and the beard and the mud. Yes, she saw all of it. But she also, for the first time, heard the sentence he had just said. Most of what's wrong with people is they don't feel small often enough. It was a sentence from the letters. It was exactly a sentence from the letters. The same voice, the same plain weight to the words. And it was coming out of this ruined-looking man's mouth in the same breath as it had come off the page, and the two things would not fit together in her head, and she hated that they wouldn't. "You wrote to me about Marcus Aurelius," she said abruptly. "In the second letter. You said a man's duty was to do the work in front of him without complaint, and without expectation of thanks." "I did." "Did you mean it, or did you copy it out of a book to impress a woman in Boston?" He didn't answer right away. He watched the road, and the wind pulled at the brim of his hat, and when he spoke, his voice had gone quieter. "My first wife died of a fever in the second winter we were here," he said. 19 years old. There was no doctor closer than 100 miles, and the pass was snowed shut. I sat up with her 4 nights, and there wasn't one thing I could do but keep the fire going and hold her hand and tell her lies about spring. He clicked to the horses, not looking at Margaret. "You want to know, did I mean it about doing the work in front of you without complaint? I'll tell you, Miss Hale, that's not a thing I read in a book. That's a thing I learned in a room with a dead girl in it, wishing I'd been a better man while she was alive to see it. The book just gave me the words for it after." The wagon rolled on. Somewhere off to the north, the hawk still hung in the sky. Margaret found she could not speak. Everything she had composed, the letter to Cora, the cold speech, the careful contempt, all of it had gone thin and cheap in her mouth. She had come out here so armored against being made a fool of that she had prepared to make a fool of him instead. And he had, just without any drama, without any bid for her pity, told her a thing so true and so heavy that she was ashamed of every sentence she'd been building since the platform. "I'm sorry," she said, "for your wife. Long time ago now." He said it gently so she'd know he wasn't shutting her out, only setting it down. "Her name was Ruth. There's a stone up on the hill above the house. I keep it clear." They rode a while in a different kind of silence than before. Not the frozen silence of the first mile. Something else. "You said you'd buried a partner too," Margaret said finally. "In the letters. Jed, my brother-in-law, Ruth's brother. We built the place together, him and me. Drowned crossing the river with the herd spring of '81. That's the same crossing killed the horse I wrote you about." He shook his head. "Rivers took a lot from me. I've a healthy respect for it. You'll want to have the same once you know the land. That river looks like nothing in July. In the shoulder seasons, it'll take your life before you finish being surprised." "You keep saying 'once I know the land,'" Margaret said, "as though I'm staying." He looked at her then, and this time it was a real look, level and unhurried, and there was no game in it at all. "No, ma'am," he said. "I keep saying it because you asked me questions, and I answer questions straight. If you go home Thursday, you'll have known the land for 4 days, and that'll be the end of it. I'm not trying to trap you into staying by how I talk. I gave up trapping people into anything a long while back. Costs more than it's worth. And that, more than the hawk, more than the seabed, more than dead Ruth on her hill, was the thing that got under Margaret Hale's skin and stayed there. Because 2 men had spent years trapping her with sweet words, and both had run the moment the words came due. And here was a man in a torn coat on the first afternoon she'd ever laid eyes on him, telling her plainly that he would not do that he found it beneath him, and she believed him. God help her, she believed him, and she did not want to. The ranch, when they came to it near dusk, was smaller than she'd imagined, and plainer. A low log house with a stone chimney, breathing smoke, a barn, some outbuildings, a corral of gray poles, and above it all, a bare hill with a single fenced stone on top. Caleb drove into the yard, set the brake, climbed down, and came around to hand her out of the wagon, and she let him, and her legs were stiff and cold, and she stumbled, and his hand caught her elbow, and held her up without fuss, and let go the moment she was steady. "Stove's laid," he said. "I'll have it warm in 10 minutes. There's a room's yours. Door's got a bolt on the inside, and I'm the only other soul on this place, so you bolt it if it eases you, and no offense taken." He was already carrying her trunk toward the door. "Supper's beans and salt pork and cornbread. It's not Boston. It's hot and there's plenty. Mr. Morgan." He stopped and turned. She stood in the cold yard in her good coat, with the whole gray, endless country around her, and she looked at him, and she made herself say it. "At the station," she said. "I said something, to myself. I thought you didn't hear it." "I heard it." Her face went hot despite the cold. "Then I owe you an apology." He set the trunk down on the frozen ground. He looked at her a long moment, and then he did a thing she did not expect. He took off his hat, and he held it against his chest, and he spoke to her with a gravity that made her feel for the first time in a very long time that she was being taken entirely seriously. "Miss Hale," he said, "you don't owe me a thing. You came 2,000 miles on the strength of some letters and a bad old photograph, and you got off that train and found a rough man eating out of a sack, and you said a true thing about how you felt. That's not a sin. That's just honesty, and I'd rather have your honesty than 100 women's manners." He turned the hat in his hands. "I'll tell you what I told myself when I saw you flinch. I told myself there's a woman who will say what she means. And I've buried the two people I loved best in this world. And I've learned there's nothing on God's earth worth more than somebody who'll say what they mean. So don't apologize. Just eat your supper and sleep. And Thursday, you'll do whatever's right for you. That's all." He put his hat back on, picked up the trunk, and carried it inside. And Margaret Hale stood alone in the freezing yard 2,000 miles from the city that had never once wanted her exactly as she was, and felt the first crack run clean through the certainty she'd carried off the train. She did not sleep that night, though the room was warm and the bed was better than she'd expected, and the bolts slid home easy on the door. She lay in the dark and listened to the strange sounds of the place, the wind working at the eaves, the settle and pop of the stove, once the long low call of a wolf somewhere far off that raised the hair on her arms. And she thought. She thought about the two men who'd left her. The first, Thomas, had been a lawyer's son with beautiful manners and a beautiful face, the kind of face she'd stupidly gone looking for on the platform today. He had courted her for a year. He had praised her wit at dinner parties, used her opinions as his own, called her his equal in front of company. And 3 weeks before the wedding, he had sat her down and explained kindly, so kindly, that his mother felt Margaret was perhaps a little forceful for the position, that a wife oughtn't to correct her husband in public, that surely Margaret understood. And when Margaret had said she understood perfectly, and would he please leave her house, he had looked wounded, as though she were the one being cruel. The second Robert had been worse because he'd lasted longer, and she'd let herself believe more. Robert had actually liked to argue with her, or she'd thought he had. Right up until the argument that mattered over whether she'd keep teaching after they married, and he'd discovered that when Margaret Hale said no, she meant no, and a woman who meant no was not. It turned out a woman he wished to marry. He'd found a quiet girl within the season. Margaret had gone to the wedding. She still didn't know why. Twice she'd been told in so many words that the very thing she was would have to be filed down before a man could live with it. And today, a rough stranger in a torn coat had told her that the thing she was the most valuable thing he'd ever known. That was the trouble. That was exactly the trouble. She had come out here braced for humiliation, and instead, she'd been handed the one thing Boston had never given her, and it had come wrapped in mud and jerky and a beard, and she didn't know what to do with a gift she couldn't respect the packaging of. Toward morning, she got up and unbolted the door and went out to the main room to find it already warm. The stove going, and a pot of coffee at the edge of it, and Caleb gone. Through the window she could see him out at the barn in the blue pre-dawn dark, moving among the horses, his breath and theirs going up in clouds. She poured herself coffee. It was strong and bitter and good. On the plank table by the window there was a shelf of books, and she went to it expecting almanacs, expecting nothing. There was the Coo book on the birds. There was a fat geology text with the spine broken from use. There was Marcus Aurelius, of course, the pages soft as cloth. There was a history of the Roman Republic and one of the territories, and a thick book on cattle husbandry, annotated in the margins in his plain hand, and a slim volume of poems by a man named Whitman that fell open from use to a page she didn't recognize, and a Bible and a book on the economics of the railroads, with whole passages underlined, and beside one of them in the margin, in that hand, she'd have known anywhere now, 3 words. "This is theft," it said. Margaret stood holding the coffee and reading a rancher's furious 3-word argument with a book about railroad economics, and she began quietly in the empty warm room to laugh, and then without any warning at all to cry, and she couldn't for the life of her have told you which one she was doing more. When Caleb came in from the barn stamping snow off his boots, she'd got herself back in hand mostly, and was sitting at the table with the coffee and the railroad book open in front of her. He saw what she was reading. He hung his hat on the peg. "You disagree," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd read her face. On the contrary. Margaret turned the book so the margin faced him and tapped the 3 words. I think you're too kind. Theft implies they took something that wasn't theirs. What they built was a machine designed from the first bolt to take, and to call it theft is to grant it a moral standing it never had. It isn't a thief, it's a system. You can hang a thief. She looked up at him. You can't hang a system. That's rather the whole problem, wouldn't you say? The room went very quiet. Caleb Morgan stood by the door with the cold still coming off his coat, and he looked at Margaret Hale, sitting at his table, taking apart his margin note. And something happened in his weathered face that she would remember, she thought, for the rest of her life, however long it turned out to be. It was not admiration exactly. Admiration she'd had before, cheap and easy from men who wanted her to perform. This was something else. This was a man who had lived out here alone with his books and his dead and his 300 head of cattle for years, arguing with margins because there was no one to argue with. Hearing for the first time the argument answered back, he crossed the room slowly and sat down across the table from her. He picked up the book. He read his own note, as though seeing it new. And then he looked at her, and he said in a low voice, "Say that again. About the system. Say it slow. I want to get it right." And Margaret Hale, twice left at the altar, told too many times she was too much sitting in a log house in Wyoming territory, at dawn, in a plain warm room, said it again slow. And he listened. He leaned in over the table, and he listened to every word like it was water, and he'd been out on the dry country all his life. And when she finished, he sat back and let out a long breath and shook his head and said, "I've been wrong about that for 2 years. 2 years I've had that note in there, and it was wrong the whole time. You just fixed it in one morning." He looked at the book, then at her. "There's not a man in this territory could have fixed it. Maybe not a man in Boston. And you did it before breakfast." He got up and went to the stove and got the beans going for breakfast, and he was quiet for a while. And then over the pop of the fire he said, not turning around, in a careful voice like a man stepping on ice. He wasn't sure of. "Thursday's a ways off yet. You don't have to think on it now. But I'll say just the once and then leave it be. It's been a long time since anybody argued with me at my own table, Miss Hale. I'd forgot how much I missed it. I'd near forgot I was the kind of man that missed it." He stirred the beans. "That's all. I'll not say it again. Eat something. There's cornbread in the tin." Margaret sat at the table with the railroad book open in front of her, and the coffee going cold, and the strange warm room around her. And outside the window, the gray country stretched away under the risen sun to the far curved edge of the world. And up on the hill above the house, a single stone stood clear of snow, because a man kept it clear, and she thought about the eastbound train that came through Thursday. And for the first time, since she'd stepped off the westbound and dropped her suitcase in the snow, she was not certain at all that she'd be on it. She had come to Wyoming braced to have been wrong about the letters. She was only now beginning to understand the far more frightening thing, that she had been wrong all right. But not about the letters. She'd been wrong on the platform. She'd been wrong in the one single minute it took to look at a torn coat and a paper sack and a month of beard and decide she knew a man. She'd been wrong the way Boston had always been wrong about her judging the whole book by a glance at the cover, and she'd promised herself her entire furious life that she was better than that, better than the people who'd never once looked past the shape of her to the mind underneath. And here on a frozen platform in a strange country, she had done to a stranger the exact cruelty that had been done to her, and she hadn't even had the grace to feel it until now. The cornbread was warm and good. The coffee, even cold, was better than anything she'd had in Boston. And Caleb Morgan stood at his stove in his torn coat, humming something low and tuneless under his breath. A man who kept his dead wife's stone clear of snow and argued with railroad economics in the margins, and had told a stranger off a train that her honesty was worth more to him than 100 women's manners. Margaret picked up her fork. "Mr. Morgan," she said. "Ma'am, when you've eaten, would you show me the ranch?" He turned from the stove, and this time it was not almost a smile. This time it was the whole thing, slow and real and startled, breaking across that rough face like sun coming up over the seabed hills, and it changed him so completely that Margaret set down her fork and simply stared, because for one moment She could see plain as anything. Exactly the man who had written those 11 letters, standing right there in front of her the whole time, and she wondered how in the world she had ever even for a minute failed to see him. "Yes, ma'am," Caleb Morgan said. "I surely would." Outside, the wind came down off the north country where the hawk had come from, and it worked at the eaves of the low log house, and the smoke went up straight and steady from the stone chimney into a hard blue sky. And 2,000 miles to the east, a city that had never wanted her went on without Margaret Hale, and did not know yet, would not know for years exactly what it had lost. She would learn the land. She could feel it settling into her. Even now, the intention of it quiet and certain under her disappointment and her shame and her stubborn Boston pride. She would learn the birds and the seabed and the river that took what it wanted. She would learn the man, but not today. Today she would eat her cornbread and let him show her the corral and the barn and the cattle and the hill with the stone, and she would keep her promise to make no promises. She had crossed 2,000 miles on the strength of a stranger's words and been broken by a single glance and begun over one cold Wyoming morning to be put back together in a shape she didn't yet recognize. The eastbound came Thursday. She had until then to decide whether she was the kind of woman brave enough to be wrong out loud and to stay, and to find out what she'd nearly thrown away on a train platform in the cold. She thought, sitting there with the fork in her hand and the man's whole true face still turned toward her across the table, that she just might be. She did show him she meant to stay before she ever said it out loud, and she did it without meaning to over the next 3 days, one small refusal at a time. The first was Tuesday morning. Caleb had gone out to break ice on the stock tanks, and Margaret alone in the warm house found herself standing at the shelf of books again, and then found herself not reading, but going to the door and putting on the heavy coat he'd left hanging there for her. A coat that swallowed her whole and smelled of wood smoke and horse and him, and walking out into the cold to find him. She didn't have a reason. She told herself she wanted to see how a stock tank was broken. That was a lie, and she knew it was a lie by the time she reached the barn. "You'll want gloves," he said without turning around. "Left side on the peg." "How did you know it was me?" "Nobody else out here to be." He swung the axe once more, and the ice gave with a crack, and the horses came shouldering in to drink. "Also, you walk like a Boston woman crossing a floor she thinks is dirty. Heard you from the tank." Margaret opened her mouth to be offended and found she was almost smiling instead. "I do not." "You surely do." He set the axe head down and leaned on the handle. "Nothing wrong with it. Just says where a person's from." "And how does a Wyoming man walk?" "Like the ground might give out. Because out here it sometimes does." He looked at her then, and there was that easing at his eyes. "You'll walk like us by spring if you're still here." "If," she said. If he agreed, and picked the axe back up, and did not push it 1 inch further, and that she was learning was the whole of him. He never pushed. He said the true thing once, and let it lie where it fell, and went back to work, and it made her want, against all her training, to be the one who picked it back up. That was the first refusal. She refused to go back inside. She stayed out in the brutal cold, and watched him water the horses, and muck the barn, and check the feet of a lame mare. And she asked him questions, and he answered everyone straight. And by the time they came in for the noon meal, her feet were numb, and her nose was running, and she felt more awake than she had in 10 years in a heated Boston parlor. The second refusal was Tuesday night, and it was harder. They had argued at supper. It had started over the Whitman of all things, the slim book of poems that fell open from use. She'd asked him why a man who prized endurance and plain work above all things kept a book by a poet who did nothing but sprawl and sing and love the whole world at once, and he'd set down his fork and thought about it a good while, the way he thought about everything, and then he'd said something that she hadn't been ready for, because he's the only one who wrote it down. "Like I feel it," Caleb said. "You get out here alone long enough, Miss Hale, and some morning the light comes up over that seabed ridge and hits the frost, and the whole country lights up like the inside of God's own head, and there's not one soul for 40 miles to say it to. And a man could go a little crazy with all that beauty and nobody to hand it to." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Then one day, a book comes in the mail order, and this dead fella in it is standing there hollering that he feels the exact same thing, that he's drunk on it too, that it near breaks him too. And you understand you were never as alone as you thought. That's what he's for. He's for the mornings that are too big to carry by yourself. Margaret sat very still. That's not endurance, she said quietly. That's the opposite of endurance. That's surrender. No, ma'am. He shook his head slow. That's what endurance is for. You don't endure so you can keep enduring. That'd be a fool's bargain. You endure so you're still standing on the morning the light comes up. The enduring's just the price. The morning's the thing you're buying. He looked up at her. I'd have thought a woman who came 2,000 miles would understand that better than most. You endured Boston. Question is, what you endured it to buy. And there it was laid on the table between the beans and the cornbread, so plainly that she couldn't pretend he hadn't said it. She'd endured 29 years of being too much. What had she endured it to buy? She didn't answer. She couldn't. She got up and cleared the plates so he wouldn't see her face, and he let her. And when she came back to the table, her voice was steadier, and she picked another fight about Rome this time, safer ground, and they argued the Republic clean into the night until the fire burned down low, and she realized with a start that it was near 11 o'clock, and she had not once thought of the eastbound train. That was the second refusal. She refused to end the evening. She could have gone to her room hours before. She stayed at the table and argued a man about Rome until the fire died, because she could not make herself leave the only conversation in 10 years that had left her feeling larger instead of smaller. The third refusal came Wednesday, and it nearly undid her, and it had nothing to do with talk. She woke before dawn to shouting. Not words at first, just a man's voice raised in the dark, hoarse and urgent, and the crash of something knocked over, and Margaret was out of bed and had the bolt back and the door open before she was fully awake, standing in the main room in her nightdress, with her heart going like a hammer. The front door stood open to the freezing dark. Caleb was gone. Out in the yard she could hear him, and now she caught the words, come on, don't you do this, not you too, come on now. And under his voice a sound she didn't know, a long, low groan of an animal in trouble. And she snatched up his coat off the peg and ran out into the snow in her bare feet before her mind caught up to her body. He was in the barn. He had a lantern hung and a cow down on her side in the straw. A big red cow, her flanks heaving, her eyes rolling white, and Caleb was down in the muck beside her with his coat off, and one arm gone to the shoulder inside the animal, and his face set like stone. Calf's turned, he said, not looking up, not asking how she'd come to be there. Breech and turned both. If I can't get it round in the next few minutes, I lose 'em both. Get to her head. Talk to her. Keep her from thrashing. She'll break my arm, and then we're all done. Margaret did not think. There was no room to think. She dropped to her knees in the filthy straw at the cow's head in her nightdress, and put both hands on the great heaving neck, and did the only thing she knew, which was talk low and steady, the way she'd read to dying students, the way nobody had ever once talked to her when she was afraid. There now, he's got you. You're all right. He's the most stubborn man in the territory. He told me so himself. He won't let you go there now. Keep on, Caleb gritted. It's helping. Keep on. She kept on. She talked that cow through the worst 10 minutes of the night, while a man she'd known 3 days lay in the muck with his arm inside a dying animal, and worked by feel alone in the dark. Sweat standing on his forehead in the cold, his jaw locked, saying under his breath a steady stream of curses and prayers so mixed together she couldn't tell which was which. And then he made a sound, a sharp grunt of effort, and said, "There, fierce and low, there you are, come on." And there was a rush and a slither, and the cow gave one great final heave, and a wet dark shape came out into the straw and lay still. Too still. "No," Caleb said. "No, you don't." He was already on it, wiping muck from the little thing's nose and mouth with his bare hands working, and it lay slack. And Margaret watched a man's whole face fall in the lantern light. And then he did a thing she would never forget. He bent down and put his own mouth over the calf's wet nose, and breathed into it once, twice, a rough, desperate tenderness she'd have sworn no man alive was capable of, and rubbed hard at its ribs with the flat of his hand and said, come on you. Your mama went to a lot of trouble." And the calf coughed. It coughed and shook its wet head and drew a breath, and then another. And Caleb Morgan sat back in the bloody straw with his arms hanging and let out a breath that shook, and Margaret realized her own face was wet and had been for a while. "Is it?" she started. "She'll do." His voice was rough. "They'll both do. Give her a minute, she'll be up." He looked over at Margaret, then really looked, and seemed to see her for the first time since she'd run out kneeling in the muck in her white nightdress, with her hair down, and her bare feet blue. And something crossed his face that was almost alarm. "Miss Hale, your feet. How long you been out here without—" He was up and had his coat off her shoulders and around her, again tucking it, and had scooped her up off the straw entirely before she could protest. Lifted her clean off the ground like she weighed nothing. And it was so sudden and so unlike anything a man had ever done to her that she went completely rigid in his arms. "Put me down. Mr. Morgan, I am perfectly—" "Your feet are white. You'll lose toes." He was already carrying her out of the barn and across the yard through the snow. "Argue with me inside where it's warm. I'll argue back, I promise. Just not out here." He carried her into the house and set her down in the chair by the stove and knelt and took her frozen feet in his two big hands. Hands that had been inside a cow 10 minutes ago and were only just wiped clean. And he began to rub warmth back into them, brisk and impersonal and utterly focused, the way he did everything. And Margaret Hale sat there in a stranger's coat with her hair down, and let a man she'd known 3 days chafe the blood back into her feet, and she thought with a clarity that frightened her worse than the cold ever had, "I would not have done that for anyone. And he did not even stop to think about doing it for me." "There's no feeling coming back," she said, because she had to say something. "It'll come. It'll hurt when it does, I'll warn you now. That's how you know it's working." He glanced up. "You went out in the snow in your bare feet for a cow you never met." "You were shouting." "I was." He went back to her feet. "Most people, they hear a man shouting in the dark, they bolt the door tighter. You came running with my coat." He said it plainly, but there was something underneath it, something working, and he didn't look up when he said the next part. "That's not a Boston thing, Miss Hale. That's not manners. Manners keep you inside. You came out. I'll remember that." The feeling came back into her feet then all at once in a rush of pins and fire that made her gasp and grab the arms of the chair, and he held her feet steady through it and said, "There it is. Ride it out. It passes." And it did pass, and when it had, she was warm and it was near dawn and a cow and her calf were alive in the barn, because a difficult woman from Boston had run out into the snow, and Margaret understood that she had refused a third time the largest refusal yet, without a single word. She had refused to be a guest. Sometime in the dark of that barn, kneeling in the muck with her hands on a dying animal, she had stopped being a woman visiting until Thursday and become something else. Something with a stake in whether things on this place lived or died, and there was no unrefusing it now. She could still get on the eastbound, but she would be leaving something behind if she did, and they both knew it, and neither of them said it because he never pushed, and she was too proud and too frightened to say it first. Wednesday passed strange and quiet after that. They were tired, both of them, from the night. Caleb went about his work slower than usual, and she caught him more than once standing still in the middle of some task, looking at nothing, and once she came around the corner of the barn and found him just standing in the door of it, looking at the red cow and her calf, and he didn't hear her. And she watched him a moment, this rough, tired man in his torn coat watching a calf nurse. And she saw on his unguarded face a thing she had no name for. A kind of quiet, ferocious gladness. The face of a man who had lost enough that a single calf living through a cold night could fill him up to the brim. And she backed away without letting him know she'd seen it, because it felt like she'd walked in on him praying. That evening he was quiet at supper, and she thought it was tiredness until he set down his fork and folded his hands, and said in the careful voice she'd learned, meant he'd been turning something over all day. "Thursday's tomorrow." The words landed in the warm room like a stone in a still pond. "I'm aware," Margaret said. "I'll drive you in if you want to go. Eastbound comes through 11 o'clock. I'll pay the fare like I said. No hard feelings." He was looking at his folded hands, not at her. I want to say a thing first, though, and I want you to know I'll only say it the once, and then whatever you decide, I'll not throw it up at you or make you feel small for it. I've had that done to me, and I'd not do it to anybody." Margaret's heart was going hard. "Say it then." He was quiet a moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and it was not quite steady, and she understood that this was costing him something, that this plain, unhurried man was frightened, and the sight of his fear moved her more than any smooth speech ever could have. "I've been alone 11 years, Caleb said. "Ruth, then Jed, then just me and the cattle and the books and the winters. And I made my peace with it. I want you to understand that. I didn't put that advertisement in the paper because I was a lonely man dying for a wife. I put it in because I read one too many good books I had nobody to argue with about, and it near drove me out of my mind all that thinking with no place to put it. That's the truth. I wanted a mind. I didn't expect a—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I didn't expect you. I didn't expect somebody who'd fix a 2-year-old mistake in my margins before breakfast and argue me about Whitman till the fire died and come running into the snow in her bare feet for a cow. I made my peace with being alone, Miss Hale, and in 3 days you've gone and broke that peace all to pieces, and I'll be honest with you, I don't know if I can make it again after you're gone, so that's my fear. That's the whole of it, and I'm telling you plain because you told me plain at the station how you felt, and I owe you the same." The room was silent except for the fire. Margaret Hale looked at the man across the table, and she thought about Boston, and Thomas, and his mother, and Robert, and his quiet girl, and every man who had ever admired her mind, right up until the moment it became inconvenient, and she thought about the 3 words in the margin, and the hawk hanging in the wind, and the calf that coughed and lived because a rough man breathed into it in the dark, and she opened her mouth to answer him, and found she couldn't because her throat had closed, and so instead she reached across the table and put her hand over his folded hands, and she left it there. He went very still. "I'm not going," she said when she could. "I decided Tuesday. I've been too proud to say it." Caleb Morgan looked down at her hand on his, and then up at her face, and for a moment he could not seem to speak either, and the two of them sat there in the firelight. 2 people who had spent their whole lives being told they were too much, and had finally impossibly found the one other person on earth who thought they were exactly enough. "Tuesday," he said finally, and his voice cracked on it, and he cleared his throat and tried again. "You decided Tuesday, and let me sit here and make a fool of myself with a whole speech. You didn't make a fool of yourself." She was almost laughing and almost crying the way she had over the railroad book. "You made the finest speech any man's ever made me, and every man before you made speeches with a beautiful face and a lying heart, and you made yours with a torn coat and meant every word, and I will never, as long as I live, get on a train away from a man who means every word." He turned his hands over under hers so that he was holding her hand now, instead of being held, and his grip was warm and careful, and he looked at her like a man looking at the light coming up over the seabed ridge. "Then you'll marry me," he said. "For real, not on paper. Preacher comes through Cheyenne first of the month. You'll stand up in front of God in this whole rough country and marry me, Margaret Hale." "Yes," she said, "I will." And that ought to have been the happy end of it. The whole story wrapped up warm by the fire. And if this were one of the smooth Boston tales Margaret had grown up on, it would have been. But this was Wyoming, and the country did not care what 2 people had decided at a supper table, and the country was about to remind them both in the hardest way it knew exactly whose land they were standing on. It began the next morning with the weather. Caleb came in from the barn before dawn with his face gone grim in a way she hadn't seen, and he stood at the window looking north a long time, and when she asked him what was wrong, he said, "Sky's wrong," and would not say more for a while. Then over coffee he told her plain. There was a storm coming down out of the north country, out of the place the hawk had come from, and it was coming fast, and it was coming mean. He could feel it in the pressure, and read it in the way the stock were bunching, and before it hit, he had to get to the far fence line and shut the drift gates, or the cattle would drift ahead of the wind for miles, and pile up against the wire and smother whole herd lost in a single night. He'd seen it happen to a neighbor. He would not let it happen here. "Then I'll come," Margaret said. "No." It was the first flat no he'd ever given her, and it landed hard. "I can ride," she said. "You taught me Monday. I can help you with the gates. It'll go twice as fast with two." "Margaret." He said her Christian name for only the second time, and it stopped her. "You can ride a gentle horse in a still yard. You cannot ride a green horse in a north wind with the light going and the ground you don't know. If I have to worry about you out there, I'll make a mistake, and a mistake out there costs a life. I need you here. I need you to keep the fire high and the coffee hot and the lamp in the window so I've got a light to ride back to. That's not a small job. In a whiteout, a lamp in a window is the difference between a man getting home and a man dying 200 yards from his own door because he rode past it in the dark. I've near done it. You keep that lamp burning and you'll have done more to save my life than any fence gate. Now will you do that for me, or will you fight me on the one morning I've got no time to be fought?" She looked at him. Every instinct she had, 29 years of instinct, told her to fight, to insist, to prove she was not a woman to be left behind by a fire like some helpless thing. And then she looked at his face, and she saw it wasn't Boston in his no. It wasn't Thomas's mother saying a woman oughtn't. It was a man who'd sat up 4 nights with a dying wife, because the pass was snowed shut, telling her in the only way he knew that he could not survive losing another person to this country. And would she please this? Once let him keep her safe. "I'll keep the lamp burning," she said. Go now, you're wasting light arguing with me." Relief went through him so plainly she could see it. He crossed the room and took her face in both his cold hands and looked at her one long moment. And then he kissed her forehead quick and hard the first time he'd touched her like that and said, "That's my girl," rough and low, and was out the door and up on the horse and gone into the gray before she could even lift her hand to where his mouth had been. She kept the lamp burning. She kept it burning through the morning, which turned dark as evening by 10 o'clock. She kept it burning through the first snow, which did not fall so much as fly sideways, thick out of a sky the color of a bruise. She kept it burning through the afternoon, when the wind came up so hard, it found every crack in the log walls, and made the whole house moan when she could no longer see the barn 40 feet away. When the world outside the window went to a solid roaring white. And she understood for the first time in her sheltered life what men out here meant by the word whiteout, that it was not an absence of light, but a wall of it, a blindness, a thing that could stand a man 20 feet from his own door and kill him. And she kept it burning through the dark when he did not come back. Noon came and went when he'd said he'd be back by. She told herself the gates had taken longer. 1 o'clock. 2. She built the fire high and set the coffee at the edge of the stove to stay hot, and she trimmed the lamp and set it dead center in the window, and she stood beside it and watched the white roaring. Nothing where the yard used to be, and she told herself, he knows this country. He's ridden it 11 years, he'll come. 3 o'clock. The light, what little there was, began to fail. She lit a second lamp and set it in the window too. 4. She could not stand still any longer. She paced from the window to the door to the window, her hands twisting in her apron, and she began without deciding to talk out loud to the empty house the way she'd talked to the cow to keep the fear from taking her whole. "You come back," she said. "You hear me? Caleb Morgan, you come back to this house. You did not wait 11 years and make that speech and let me say yes just to freeze to death in a fence line the very next day. I won't have it. I will not lose you the way I lose everything right when I finally got my hands on it. Do you hear me? You come back." Dark came full. The storm did not slack. And Margaret Hale, who had never in her life prayed and meant it, got down on her knees on the plank floor beside the window with the 2 lamps burning above her, and prayed to a God she'd argued about in the abstract for 29 years, prayed like the rough man had breathed into the calf, desperate and tender and furious. "Please, please, not this one. You can have had the others. You can have had Boston and Thomas and all of it, but not this one. Please, I am asking. You bring him back to the light in the window." And that was when she heard it. Not the door, not a horse. A sound under the wind so faint she thought at first she'd made it up out of wanting it. A man's voice, hoarse and far off and calling something, and she was up off her knees and across the room, and had the door hauled open against the shrieking wind before she'd even decided to move, and the cold and the snow came in like the sea, and she could see nothing, nothing. A solid white wall, an arm's length from her face, and she screamed his name into it. "Caleb!" At the top of her lungs. "Caleb, the house! The house is here!" And grabbed the lamp off the window and held it out into the storm, with her arm shaking a single spark of gold in all that killing white, and out of the white closer than she'd have believed a shape. A horse staggering crusted white to the eyes. And slumped on its neck, barely a man anymore. Just a weight, a rider frozen half out of the saddle. One hand still knotted in the mane by a grip that had stopped being a decision, and become just the last stubborn refusal of a body to fall. Caleb. She got the lamp back on the window ledge, and she went out into it in her shoes. No coat out into the storm that could kill her in an hour, and she got her shoulder under him as he came off the horse, and he came off all at once. Dead weight, a big frozen man crashing down onto a woman half his size, and she did not fall. She would not fall. She locked her knees and took his weight, and she screamed at him over the wind. "Walk, you walk! I can't carry you, damn you! You walk the doors 10 feet! I've got you! Walk!" And some last ember in him heard her, and his frozen legs moved one step too, and she dragged, and he stumbled, and the horse she left. God forgive her, she left the horse, and she got him through the door and kicked it shut on the storm, and they went down together in a heap on the floor in the blessed roaring warmth, and she got out from under him and got her hands on his face, and his face was gray, and his lips were blue, and his eyes were shut, and for one endless second he did not move at all. "No," she said. "No, no, no, you did not come all this way to die on my floor. Caleb? Caleb?" She struck him across the face, open-handed hard, and struck him again, and on the second blow, his eyes came open unfocused and found her, and his blue lips moved, and what he said, what the frozen half-dead man said, looking up at the woman who'd hauled him out of the storm was, "Saw the lamp." And Margaret Hale put her face down against his frozen chest, and made a sound that was not a word at all. And then she got up, because he was not saved yet. He was only inside, and inside a frozen man could still die easy. And she knew that the way she suddenly knew a great many things she'd never been taught, and she went to work. She got the wet crusted coat off him, and the frozen boots fighting the laces with fingers that shook, and she got him out of the ice-stiff clothes down to the skin, and did not once think of modesty. There was no room for it. There was only the gray of his skin, and the blue of his lips, and the terrible stillness of him. She dragged every blanket in the house down off the beds, and wrapped him in them by the stove. She got the coffee still hot, and lifted his head, and got a little between his lips, and he swallowed, which meant he was alive, which meant there was a fight to be had. And Margaret Hale had never in her life run from a fight. But he was so cold. The blankets weren't enough. His teeth had begun to chatter, which he'd told her once days ago at the supper table, telling her about the country, telling her the things she'd need to know. Was good, was the body fighting back, but under the chattering, his skin was still gray, and his hands, where she chafed them, stayed slack and would not close, and she remembered in a rush the thing he'd told her that same night offhand, a fact about the country, the way you warm a man. The cold's got deep into when there's no other heat to be had. She didn't hesitate. Later, she would marvel that she didn't hesitate, that the woman who'd been called cold and difficult her whole life by men who wanted her softer, did the warmest and most fearless thing of her life without a single second's pause. She got out of her own wet clothes down to her shift, and she got in under the blankets with him, and she wrapped herself around all that killing cold, and she held him. And she gave him the only heat left in that house that mattered, the heat of her own living body, and she pressed her warm cheek to his frozen one. And she talked to him low and steady, the way she'd talked to the cow, the way nobody had ever talked to her. "There now," she said. "There now. I've got you. You're home. You saw the lamp, and you came to it, and I've got you, and I am not letting go. You breathe. That's all you have to do now is breathe and be warm and let me hold on. There now. There now, my dear. There now." She held him through the night. She held him while the storm screamed itself out against the walls. She held him while the gray went out of his skin. Slow, so slow, and the color came back into his lips, and the terrible slack cold of him gave way inch by inch to warmth. Her warmth poured into him without stint. She held him while his chattering stilled, and his breathing went from ragged to deep and even, while somewhere past midnight he stopped being a frozen thing. She was fighting to save, and became simply a sleeping man in her arms, worn out alive, breathing slow against her shoulder. She held him, and did not sleep because she was afraid to, because it seemed to her that her staying awake was part of the bargain she'd made on her knees, that as long as she kept watch, he'd keep breathing, and she was not fool enough now to test it. And somewhere in the deepest part of that night, holding a man's whole warm sleeping weight against her, Margaret Hale understood a thing so completely and so quietly that it did not feel like a discovery at all, but like a memory, like something she'd always known and only just now let herself say. She understood that 4 days ago, she had stood on a train platform and looked at a beard and a torn coat and a paper sack and thought, I have made the worst mistake of my life, and that she had been more wrong in that 1 minute than she had ever been about anything ever in 29 years of being right about nearly everything. She had looked at the outside of a man and read his whole worth off it in a glance, the exact cruelty 100 people had done to her, and she had been so certain. And the man she'd dismissed in that minute had in 4 days argued her about the soul until the fire died and breathed life into a dying calf with his own mouth, and warmed her frozen feet in his 2 hands, and ridden out into a killing storm to save 300 head of cattle, and dragged himself home half dead to a lamp in a window, and the last thing he'd said before the cold took him under was, "Not help me, or I'm dying," but saw the lamp, which was to say, "Thank you," which was to say, "You were there," which was to say, "Of course you were. Of course you kept the light burning because that is who you are." He knew who she was. In 4 days, a rough stranger from Wyoming knew who she was better than Boston had learned in 29 years. Toward dawn, he stirred. His breathing changed, and his hand, the one that had been slack all night, closed slow around her wrist, and she felt the strength come back into it. Real strength. A living grip, and she lifted her head from where she'd rested it against his hair, and looked at his face. And his eyes were open and clear, and looking up at her, and he was warm, all the way warm alive, hers. "Margaret," he said. His voice was a ruin, cracked and raw, but it was his voice. "I'm here. You came out in the storm." He was working it out slow, the way he worked everything, piecing the night back together. "No coat. You came out in the storm for me. Same as the cow." A ghost of something crossed his face. Not a smile, yet he was too spent for a smile, but the beginning of one. "Told you. Not a Boston thing." "No," she said. Her voice broke on it. "Not a Boston thing." He looked at her a long moment, this rough, spent man wrapped in every blanket in the house, warmed back to life by a difficult woman's body. And whatever he saw in her face made his own face go soft and grave and full. And he lifted the hand that gripped her wrist and moved it slow to her face and touched her cheek with one warm finger, wonderingly like a man touching something he'd been sure the country had taken from him and found against all the odds of that hard land it had given back. "I looked at you on that platform," Margaret said before she could stop herself, before pride could shut her mouth, "and I thought I'd made the worst mistake of my life." "I know," he said. "I saw it. I told you I saw it. I want to say the rest of it now." She put her hand over his, holding it to her face. "I was wrong. I have never in my life been so wrong. I looked at the outside of you, and I thought I knew the whole book. And the whole book, Caleb, the whole book is—" She couldn't finish. There weren't words even for a woman who'd always had words, but he understood. He always understood. That was the thing about him. The whole thing, the thing no beautiful lying face in Boston had ever once managed. He understood. "Then it wasn't the worst mistake," he said low, and cracked, and certain, holding her face in the gray of the dawn, while the dead storm let the first light through the window at last. "It was the best one you ever made. You just had to live a winter to find it out." And Margaret Hale, who had crossed 2,000 miles on the strength of a stranger's words and been broken by a single glance and put back together over 4 impossible days, looked down at the man the country had nearly taken from her twice and given back, and knew that he was right, that he was exactly right, that she had gotten off a train 4 days ago and made the best mistake of her whole difficult life, and that she would spend the rest of it, every winter of it, being grateful she'd been wrong. They were married on the 1st of the month in Cheyenne, in a plain church with a wood stove and 11 people. Margaret had never met, and it was the strangest and truest wedding she could have imagined, and it very nearly did not happen at all. Because the thing about Wyoming she was learning was that it never let you have a good day without first trying to take it from you. The trouble started before they ever reached town. Caleb had recovered from the storm slower than he'd let on. He was up and working within 3 days, stubborn as a fence post. But Margaret had held that man's frozen body through a whole night, and she knew the difference now between a man who was well and a man who had decided to be well, and Caleb Morgan had merely decided. His cough had settled deep in his chest and stayed there. It came on him at night, a wet, racking sound she didn't like, and when she pressed her ear to his back, the way she'd once pressed it, listening for the calf, she heard something in there that frightened her, a wet crackle, low in the lung. And she was Boston educated enough to know what that could turn into, out here, where the nearest doctor was 100 miles and a snowed pass away. "It's nothing," he told her the morning they were to leave for the wedding. "Winter cough. I've had it 10 years running. You've had a winter cough. This is not that." She had her hand flat on his chest. "Caleb, I sat up 4 nights with nobody's help while somebody I loved got worse, and there was nothing I could do. You told me that story yourself. I will not do it again. If that cough is what I think it's turning into, we are not riding to Cheyenne to get married. We are riding to Cheyenne to find a doctor, and we'll get married after, when I know you'll be alive to see the year out." He looked at her a long moment, and something moved in his face, and she braced for the fight. The flat? No, the pride. Instead, he put his hand over hers on his chest and said quiet, "You'd do that. You'd put off your own wedding to see a doctor about me." In a heartbeat. "Nobody's ever—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "Ruth got sick and I couldn't do anything. And now you'd throw over your own wedding day to make sure I don't." He shook his head slow. "Margaret, I'll see the doctor. First thing before the church. You have my word. But I'll not put off marrying you one more day than the storm already cost us. We'll do both, doctor then preacher. That's the bargain." And that was how Margaret Hale came to spend the morning of her wedding day, sitting in a doctor's cramped office in Cheyenne, while the man she was about to marry had his chest listened to by a tired frontier physician named Dr. Aldous. And it was in that office that the day's first real blow landed. Dr. Aldous listened a long time. He had Caleb breathe deep and cough and breathe again, and his face, which had started friendly, went careful. And Margaret, watching from the corner with her wedding dress in a parcel on her lap, knew that face. She'd worn it herself, kneeling by a lamp in a window, hoping the thing she feared wasn't the thing she saw. "Mr. Morgan," Dr. Aldous said, "how long has it been down this deep?" "Week. Little more. And the storm. Margaret told me. You were frozen near throughout most of a night." "I've been colder." "No, sir." The doctor said, "I don't believe you have, or you wouldn't be sitting here being cheerful about it." He set down his instrument. He looked at Margaret, then back at Caleb, and he told them plain, and Margaret was grateful for it even as it frightened her, because plain was the only kind of truth either of them could stand. There was pneumonia setting into the base of the left lung. Not full, not yet, but setting in the way ice sets into a still tank from the edges toward the middle. Caught now, it could be beaten. Left another week, worked hard in the cold, it would take the whole lung, and then it would take the man. "You do not," Dr. Aldous said, "go back out to that ranch and work fence tomorrow. You lie still and you keep warm and you let this woman nurse you for 2 weeks minimum, or I'll be reading over you come spring." The office went very quiet, and Margaret watched her husband-to-be sit with that on him. Watched him take it the way he took everything without drama turning it over, and she saw the exact moment the real weight of it landed, and it was not the weight she expected. It was not fear for himself. Caleb Morgan looked up, and the thing in his face was not fear, it was grief. And he said to the doctor, but really to her, 2 weeks flat on my back, in winter, with 300 head to feed and water and the drift gates to mind and the wood to cut. He said it low. Doc, you might as well tell me to let the lung go. 2 weeks off that place in deep winter and there's no place to come back to. The cattle die and then the bank takes the note and then it's all gone anyhow. Ruth's and Jed's and mine, all of it gone, and me alive to watch it go. You're asking me to choose which way I lose everything. And there it was, the trap of the country laid bare on a wedding morning. Save the man and lose the ranch. Save the ranch and lose the man. And Margaret Hale sat in the corner with her wedding dress on her lap, and understood that this was the moment, this exact moment, that the whole of her life had been shaping her for every argument, every book, every year of being told she was too much. All of it had been getting her ready to stand up in this cramped office and be at last exactly enough. No, she said, and both men turned. No, that's a false choice and I won't have it in the room. You're doing the thing you told me not to do. You're reading the whole book off one page. She stood up and set the wedding dress on the chair, and she was not a bride. In that moment, she was a woman doing sums, and her voice came out clear and hard and certain. You cannot work the ranch for 2 weeks. Fine. Then I will. Caleb stared at her. Margaret, you taught me to ride. You taught me to break the ice on the tanks. I watched you do it, and I can do it. You showed me the drift gates and where the far fence runs and which cattle are close to calving. I have watched you do every single thing on that place for a month because I could not stay indoors and be a guest, and you thought I was just being stubborn, and maybe I was. But the result is, I know how to run your ranch, Caleb Morgan, or enough of it to keep 300 head alive for 2 weeks, while their owner does not die of pride in a doctor's office. You cannot handle that place alone. It's men's work and it's hard, and the country will what? She rounded on him, and all the fear of the last week came out of her at last hot. Kill me. It nearly killed you, and I dragged you out of it. Don't you dare tell me what a woman can't handle. Don't you dare not. You're the one man in the world who was supposed to know better. You wrote to a stranger that her mind was worth more than any face. You told me at a supper table that my honesty was worth more than 100 women's manners. Well, here is my mind, and here is my honesty telling you plain. I can keep your cattle alive for 2 weeks, and I will, and you are going to lie down and let me, because I did not cross 2,000 miles and haul you out of a blizzard to lose you to a lung 2 weeks before I even get to be your wife. The office was dead silent. Dr. Aldous was looking at Margaret like a man watching weather come in. And Caleb Morgan sat there and looked at the woman he was about to marry, and slowly that whole thing happened in his face again. The sunrise over the seabed. The thing that had made her set down her fork the first morning, and his eyes went bright and wet, and he said in a voice gone thick, I put an advertisement in a paper for a wife who could think. He shook his head, wondering. Lord help me. I had no notion what I was asking for. You asked for a partner, Margaret said gentler now. You just didn't believe you'd get one. Now lie down and let me be one. They were married that afternoon after all. Caleb sat through his own wedding in a chair because he was too weak to stand the whole while, and Margaret stood beside him with her hand on his shoulder. And when the preacher got to the part about sickness and health, she felt the whole church understand at once that this was not a distant vow for these two, but a thing already happening in the room, and she saw more than one of those 11 strangers wipe their eyes. She had thought back in Boston that a wedding needed a beautiful groom on his feet, and 100 guests, and a face worth marrying. She stood in a plain church with a coughing man in a chair, and 11 people she'd never met, and it was the only wedding she'd ever been to that felt like the truth. They spent that night at the Cheyenne boarding house because Caleb was too weak to make the ride, and in the gray. Before dawn, Margaret Hale, now. Margaret Morgan kissed her sleeping husband's fevered forehead, put on his spare coat that swallowed her whole, and drove the wagon home alone through the cold to keep 300 head of cattle alive for 2 weeks by herself. And if you had told the woman who got off the westbound train a month before that she would do such a thing, and do it gladly, she would have thought you mad. The 2 weeks that followed were the hardest of her life, and she would say later, when she was old, and telling her children that they were also the making of her. She rose before light. She broke the ice on the tanks with an axe near too heavy for her, and her hands blistered, and then the blisters broke, and then they healed to calluses. And she watched her own soft Boston hands become a rancher's hands, and felt something like pride she'd never been allowed to feel about her body before, which had only ever been judged and found wanting. She loaded hay and forked it out to the cattle in the cutting wind. She rode the fence line, green horse and all, and shut the drift gates ahead of 2 smaller storms, and once found a cow calving early in a draw, and remembered in a rush of terror and then of steadiness. Exactly what Caleb had done in the barn that night, and she got down in the snow and the muck, and she did it. She turned a breech calf with her own arm, the way she'd watched him do it, and the calf lived, and she knelt there in the bloody snow afterward and laughed out loud at the empty country like a madwoman, because she, Margaret Morgan, who had been told her whole life she was good for nothing, but talk had just pulled a living calf into the world with her own 2 hands. She drove into Cheyenne twice in those 2 weeks to nurse Caleb, who was mending but slow, and to bring him word of the ranch, and those visits became the thing she lived toward. She would sit on the edge of his bed and give him the whole account, every cow, every gate, every gallon of water hauled, and he would listen, the way he listened to everything total, and he would shake his head and say, "You did that. You did that alone." And the wonder in his voice was worth more to her than every compliment every smooth man in Boston had ever paid her, because those men had praised her for being clever at a dinner table, and this man was praising her for keeping his whole world alive with her own hands. And the difference between those 2 things was the difference between being admired and being seen. It was on the second of those visits that the story took the turn Margaret never saw coming, the one that changed everything. She thought she understood about the man she'd married and the country she'd married into. She had finished her account of the ranch, and Caleb was quiet a while, propped up on his pillows, his color better, his cough looser. And then he said, not looking at her in the careful voice that meant he'd been turning something heavy over, "There's a thing I've not told you. I meant to tell you before the wedding, and then the doctor happened, and then you rode off to save my whole life, and there wasn't a right time. But you've earned the truth of it more than any woman ever earned anything working that place alone. So I'll tell you now, and you may be angry, and you'd have the right." Margaret's heart went still. "Tell me." "The ranch isn't clear." He said it flat. "There's a note on it, a big one. I told you the bank would take it if the cattle died, and that's true, but I let you think the note was small a thing a good year would clear. It ain't. Jed and I borrowed heavy to buy the second section and stock it right before he drowned, and then I was alone and a bad winter took near half the herd, and I've been 3 years just paying the interest and never touching the debt itself. The note comes due in the spring, and unless this is a very good year, a better year than I've had since Jed died, I am going to lose this ranch no matter how many calves you pull or gates you shut." He finally looked at her, and his face was bare ashamed. "I advertised for a wife who could think Margaret. What I didn't say in the advertisement is that I'm a man about to lose everything, and any woman who married me was like as not marrying her way onto a place the bank'll own by June. I should have told you before you said yes. I let you marry a sinking ship because His voice broke. "Because I wanted you so bad, I was willing to let you drown with me. And that was the lowest thing I ever did, and I've hated myself for it every day since. And now you've gone and worked yourself to the bone for 2 weeks, saving a ranch that was never going to be ours to keep. So there. That's the truth. Be angry. You've the right to more anger than any woman I ever knew." The boarding house room was very quiet, and Margaret Morgan sat on the edge of her sick husband's bed and felt a great many things move through her at once, and to her own surprise, none of them was anger or not for long. Because she was looking at a man who had just of his own free will, from a sickbed, handed her the very worst truth about himself, the truth that made him look weakest. the truth that a smoother man would have carried to his grave. Thomas had hidden his mother's disapproval until 3 weeks before the wedding. Robert had hidden that he needed a quiet wife until the vows were nearly said. Every man who had ever failed her had failed her by letting her believe a lie until the lie came due. And here was Caleb Morgan, too honest to enjoy his own wedding, confessing the ruin of his fortunes to the woman who'd just married him, because he could not stand for her to keep working in ignorance one more day. "Look at me," she said. "He did. You did a wrong thing not telling me before I said yes. I'll grant you that, and I'll not pretend otherwise because you didn't pretend to me." She took his hand. "But you have just done the rightest thing I have ever seen a man do, which is tell me the worst of it, when you didn't have to from a bed where I'd never have found it out on my own. Do you understand what that means to me? Do you have any idea? I have spent my whole life among men who told me pretty things and hid the ugly ones till it was too late to run. And you, Caleb Morgan, you can't even keep an ugly truth to yourself for 2 weeks to spare your own pride. You're constitutionally incapable of letting me be deceived. That is not a flaw in a husband. That is the only thing I have ever wanted in one. Margaret, we could lose the ranch. Then we'll lose the ranch." Beku. She said it steady, and she meant it, and saying it, she felt the last of Boston fall away from her, the last of the woman who'd thought a life was a thing you kept safe. "I did not marry a ranch. I married a man who breathes life into calves and argues Whitman till the fire dies and can't tell a lie to save his own hide. If the bank takes the land, they cannot take that. And that is the thing I came 2,000 miles for, and I would rather have it broke in a rented room than have a clear title to the finest ranch in the territory beside any other man alive." She leaned in. "But hear me. I don't intend to lose the ranch. You said unless it's a good year. So we'll make it a good year. You've got a wife who kept sums for a living before she ever kept cattle, and who just found out she can pull a calf and shut a gate besides. And I have not spent 2 weeks turning my hands to leather to hand this place to a bank. When you're well, you and I are going to sit down with those numbers every one, and we are going to find the good year in them together. Do you hear me? Together." And Caleb Morgan, propped in a sickbed with the worst confession of his life just out of his mouth, and instead of the anger he'd braced for a partner leaning in to do the sums, put his free hand over his eyes, and his shoulders shook, and Margaret understood that this strong man was weeping quiet out of pure relief, the way a person weeps when they have carried a thing alone so long they'd forgotten it could ever be set down. And she gathered him in and held his head against her shoulder the way she'd held him warm through the storm, and she said, there now, not alone anymore, that's done, that part's done." He mended fast after that. She always believed it was the confession that did it, as much as the doctor that a man heals quicker once he's set down the stone he's been carrying. And within the week, Dr. Aldous pronounced the lung clearing and let him go home. And Caleb Morgan came back to his own ranch to find it not only surviving, but thriving. The cattle fed and watered and counted a new calf in the barn that his wife had pulled alone. The wood cut the gates, minded the whole place. Held together by a Boston woman's leathered hands, and he stood in the yard and looked at it, and looked at her and could not speak, and she let him not speak because she was learning that his silences said more than most men's speeches. They did the sums together as she'd promised at the plank table where they'd first argued about railroad economics, and it was there bent over Caleb's crabbed ledgers by lamplight that Margaret Morgan's Boston education finally paid the debt the country had been trying to collect all winter. She found things in those numbers he'd never seen because he was a cattleman who did figures grudgingly by necessity, and she was a woman who had loved sums the way he loved the seabed, purely for their own sake. She found that he was selling his beef at the wrong time of year, taking the low price because he was always cash desperate in the fall. She found that the second section, the one that had near ruined them, had water on it. He wasn't using water that could let him run more stock than he thought. She found over 3 nights of arguing across that table exactly the way they'd argued about Rome and Whitman, a path through the numbers narrow but real, that ran from where they were now to a good year, if the weather held and the prices held, and they both worked like the damned. "It's there," she said finally near midnight on the third night, tapping the last column with a calloused finger. "The good year. It's right there. It's not luck, Caleb. It was never only luck. It was the timing of the sails and the water on the second section, and it was there in these numbers the whole time, and no one ever sat down long enough to find it. We can save the ranch. Not hope to. Do it. If we hold the line till spring and sell at the right time, we clear the interest, and we start on the principal. And in 3 years, 3 good years, this land is ours free, and no bank on earth can touch it." Caleb looked at the numbers, and then at her, and the look on his face was the one she'd remember on her deathbed. The look of a man who had spent 11 years believing he was alone against a country that would eventually take everything. Discovering in one midnight at his own table that he was not alone. Had not been alone since a difficult woman got off a train, and that the two of them together were something the country had not reckoned on. "I've been carrying this place on my back for 11 years, he said slowly. "Ruth then, Jed, then just me. I never once thought I'd get to set it down and have somebody carry the other end." He reached across the ledgers and took her leathered hand in his scarred one. "Margaret Morgan, I looked at your first letter, and it made me angry, and then it made me laugh, and I pinned 3 sentences of it over my desk, and I thought I knew what I was getting. A mind to argue with. Somebody for the long nights." He shook his head, his eyes bright. "I had no notion I was getting the woman who'd save the whole thing, the ranch and the lung and me. All 3. I didn't advertise for that. There's no advertisement in the world could ask for what you turned out to be." "You didn't have to ask," she said, and her own voice was thick now. "That's the whole point of it, don't you see? Every man before you asked me to be less. You just wrote to a stranger that you wanted a wife who could think, and then when she turned out to think more than you bargained for, you didn't flinch. You didn't ask her to be smaller. You leaned in over the table and said, 'Say it again, slow. I want to get it right.'" She was crying now and didn't care. "Do you know what that is, Caleb? Do you know what it is to be a woman like me and have a man say, 'Say it again slow'? It's everything. It's the entire thing I stopped believing existed. It's what I got off the train hoping for and stood on the platform, certain I'd lost." They sat there at the table a long time, the ledgers between them showing the narrow path to the good year. 2 people who had each been told their whole lives that they were somehow wrong. Too rough or too sharp. Too much, and who had crossed a whole country of loneliness to find at a plank table in Wyoming the one other person who thought they were exactly and entirely right. But the country was not done with them yet. It never was. A good year on paper at midnight in February is one thing, and a good year lived out across the calving and the branding and the drought scare of July, and the long haul of the fall drive to the railhead is another, and between the two lay every hazard the frontier could throw, and it meant to throw them all. Margaret Morgan had found the path through the numbers. Now she and Caleb would have to walk it, and the walking would test them in ways the numbers could never show. And before that year was out, the country would come for them one more time, harder than the storm, harder than the lung, in a way that neither the sums nor the seabed nor 11 years of hard-won wisdom had prepared either of them to face. The country came for them in July, and it came dressed as a man. The spring had gone well better than either of them had dared hope. The calving came in strong, and Margaret, who had pulled her first calf alone in a snowdraft in February, worked the spring calving beside her husband, like she'd been born to it, and their loss rate ran lower than any year Caleb could remember, and he said so more than once, shaking his head over the tally, that a good calving was half the good year, and they'd taken it. The branding came and went. The grass came up green and heavy off a wet spring, and the water on the second section proved out just as Margaret had found it in the numbers. And by June, they were running more stock on better grass than the ranch had carried in years. And the narrow path through the ledgers had begun day by day to feel less like a hope and more like a road they were actually walking. Then, on a hot still morning in the second week of July, a man rode into the yard on a good horse in a clean coat, and Margaret, hanging wash on the line, felt her stomach drop before he'd said a single word, because she knew a Boston kind of man when she saw one, And this was that out of place on the frontier as a fish in a tree. And men like that did not ride 100 miles into the territory in July to bring you good news. "Morning, ma'am," the man called, tipping his hat all smoothness. "I'm looking for the Morgan place. Caleb Morgan." "You found it." Margaret did not smile. "And I'm Mrs. Morgan. What's your business?" Something flickered in the man's face, at being met by the wife, and not the husband, at being met by a wife who asked his business flat, instead of fetching a man to do it for her. He covered it fast, but she saw it, and she filed it away because she'd spent her life being underestimated by exactly this kind of man, and she'd learned to watch for the flicker. "Name's Harlan Voss," he said, dismounting. "I represent the Cheyenne Cattlemen's Trust. I've some business with your husband regarding the note held on this property." He said note the way a man lays down a winning card. "Is he about?" He was about. Caleb came from the barn wiping his hands, and Margaret watched her husband's face when he saw the man, and she saw something she'd never seen on Caleb Morgan's face before. Not in the storm, not in the sickbed, not once. She saw fear. Real fear. The kind that goes back years. And it told her that whoever Harlan Voss was, he was worse than a storm and worse than a lung, because those things Caleb could face. This one, whatever it was, he'd been dreading. "Voss," Caleb said flatly. "Morgan." The smooth man smiled. "You're looking well. Better than I expected given the winter I heard you had. Nearly died, they say. Pneumonia." He clicked his tongue. "A man in your position really ought to take better care. So much depending on him." "Say what you came to say." "Of course. Straight to it. I always did admire that about you." Voss took a folded paper from his coat, unhurried, enjoying it, and Margaret hated him then, with a completeness that surprised her. "The trust has bought up your note from the Cheyenne Bank. All of it. As of the 1st of the month, you owe the money to us, not to them. And the trust, unlike the bank, is not in the business of collecting interest on frontier ranches indefinitely. We're in the business of consolidating land. So I've come to make you an offer, Morgan, and I'd advise you to take it because it's the last friendly thing that'll pass between us." He named a figure. "That's what the trust will pay you for the whole place stock and all walk-away money today. It's more than you'll clear working yourself to death for 3 more years and losing it anyway. Take it, sign, and you and the missus can start fresh somewhere. The winters don't try to kill you. Refuse it, and when that note comes due, and you're $1 short, we foreclose, and you walk away with nothing. Nothing at all." He smiled again. "I'd think hard if I were you. You've a wife to consider now. The yard was silent. Somewhere a meadowlark sang obscene in the tension, and Margaret watched her husband stand there and take it, and she saw the fear on him, and she understood all at once what it was. It was not fear of the money. It was fear of what he'd have to tell her, that the good year they'd found in the numbers the road they'd been walking since February had just been bought out from under them by a man who could simply refuse to wait. The bank would have waited. The bank wanted its interest. This man wanted the land, and he did not have to wait for anything, and there was no path through the numbers that beat a man who could simply call the note due and take it all. Caleb opened his mouth, and Margaret saw him about to do the thing. He did. The honest thing, the take the blow alone thing, saw him about to say something like, "I'll consider it," or "Give me a day." Some words to get this man off his land before his wife saw the full ruin of it, and she stepped forward before he could, wiping her wet hands on her apron, and she said in a voice she had not used since Boston, a voice she'd nearly forgotten. She owned a drawing-room voice with a blade in it. "May I see the note, Mr. Voss?" Voss blinked. "The note is a legal..." "I'm aware of what it is. I'd like to see it. I'm my husband's partner in this property, and in this debt my name is on the marriage that made his debts mine, and I have every legal right to examine an instrument that encumbers property I hold an interest in. Or does the Cheyenne Cattlemen's Trust conduct its business by refusing to let the debtors read the paper they're being threatened with?" She held out her hand, palm up steady. "The note, sir." Caleb was staring at her. So was Voss. There was a long moment where the smooth man visibly recalculated where the wife he'd dismissed while hanging wash became a different problem entirely, and Margaret watched him decide that the fastest way past her was to let her look that she was a woman, and would not understand it anyway, and he handed over the folded paper with a little bow that was meant to be gallant, and was in fact a surrender he didn't know he was making. Margaret read it. She read it the way she'd read Caleb's ledgers, the way she'd read every contract her lawyer father had left lying about the house in the years before he decided her mind was an inconvenience. The way a woman reads who has loved the cold machinery of numbers and clauses all her life, and been told all her life it was unwomanly to. She read it once fast for the shape of it, and once slow for the teeth of it, and the yard waited, and Caleb waited, and Harlan Voss waited, with his smooth smile beginning just slightly to stiffen. Because a woman who could read a promissory note that carefully was not the woman he'd ridden in expecting. And on the second reading, Margaret Morgan found it. She found it the way she'd found the good year in the ledgers. A small thing. A thing no one had looked at long enough to see, buried in the language of the assignment, the clause that transferred the note from the bank to the trust. She read it 3 times to be sure. And then she folded the paper back along its creases slow and handed it back to Harlan Voss. And she looked at him, and something in her face made his smile go out like a lamp. "The note's been improperly assigned," she said. "I beg your—" The original note from the Cheyenne Bank contains a clause requiring written notice to the borrower 30 days prior to any assignment of the debt to a third party. It's right there. You can read it yourself. It's the 4th paragraph, the one written small. "The bank was required to give my husband 30 days written notice before selling his note to you. Did they?" She let the question sit. "Did the Cheyenne Cattlemen's Trust confirm before you rode 100 miles out here to threaten a sick man on his own land that the bank gave the required notice, because my husband received no such notice? I've kept his correspondence since I arrived. Every letter, and there's been nothing from the bank. And a note assigned without the required notice. Mr. Voss is a note assigned in breach of its own terms, which means the assignment is defective. Which means you do not at this moment, standing in my yard, actually hold a valid claim to this debt at all. You hold a piece of paper the bank sold you improperly. Your quarrel is with them, not with us." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than before. Harlan Voss's face had gone from smooth to blank to something working underneath, and Margaret watched him try to find the ground she'd just taken out from under him. Watched a smooth Boston type of man discover that the woman hanging wash had just read his own instrument back to him and found the flaw his own lawyers had missed. And she felt rising in her a fierce hot joy she had not felt since the last time she'd won an argument in Boston and been punished for it. But no one was going to punish her here. She looked over at Caleb once and saw her husband staring at her with his mouth actually open, and that was worth the whole winter. "You're mistaken," Voss said, but it came out without its earlier music. "The notice provision is on the 4th paragraph, small print. Read it on your ride back and you'll see I'm right, or better yet, show it to whatever lawyer the trust keeps and watch his face. In the meantime—" And here Margaret's voice dropped and went cold, and became the voice that had ended 2 engagements and terrified 2 mothers-in-law, and gotten her called difficult across the whole of Boston society. "You are standing on my husband's land, which you do not have a valid claim to having ridden here to threaten a man recovering from pneumonia into signing away his life's work for a fraction of its worth, using a defective instrument you did not trouble to examine. I'd suggest you get back on your horse, Mr. Voss, and I'd suggest that when you report to the trust, you tell them the truth, which is that the Morgan note is not as clean as they thought they were buying, and that Mrs. Morgan reads her paper. Because we will fight this, and we will fight it on the notice clause, and we will win. And it will cost the trust more in lawyers than this ranch is worth, and I will personally see to it that every cattleman between here and Denver knows the Cheyenne Cattlemen's Trust tried to steal a sick man's land on a defective note and got beat by his wife. Do you understand me, sir? Get off our land." And Harlan Voss got off their land. He tried to save face on the way out. He made some noise about the trust reviewing the matter and being in touch through proper channels. But the smoothness was gone, and they all 3 knew it, and he mounted his good horse and rode out of the yard. a smaller man than he'd ridden in, and Margaret Morgan stood in the July sun beside the wash line, with her heart going like a drum, and watched him shrink into the distance, and did not let herself shake until he was well and truly gone. Then she shook, and Caleb caught her because her knees had gone all at once the way they do after the danger's past, and not before. And he caught her and held her up the way she'd held him up out of the storm, and she pressed her face into his shirt and laughed, and shook, and near cried all at once. And Caleb Morgan held his wife in the middle of the yard and said over and over into her hair, "You read the note, you read the note. My God, Margaret, you read the note. Fourth paragraph," she said, muffled, half hysterical. Small print. They never read their own small print. Nobody ever reads the small print. My father had a saying, the money's always in the small print, and everyone thought he was a bore for saying it. And I have wanted my whole life to be in a room where the small print mattered, and I finally, and she couldn't finish, and she didn't have to, because Caleb understood. He always understood. And he held her tighter. 12 years of school in Boston, he said, wondering, and being called difficult and unwomanly and too clever by half all, so you could stand in my yard on a July morning and beat a land shark with the fourth paragraph. Margaret. Every man who ever told you your mind was too much for a woman is a fool, and I'd like to write to each of them personally and tell them so, and enclose a copy of that note. But even as he laughed, even as he held her, Margaret felt the fear come back into him under the laughter, and she pulled back and looked at his face and saw it. And she said, "What? We won. He's gone." "What is it?" "He's gone for now." Caleb's face was grave. "You bought us time, Margaret, and God knows you bought it brilliant, but hear me. A man like Voss, a trust like that, they don't lose because the small print beat them once. They fix the small print. They'll go back to the bank and make the bank give the notice proper this time, 30 days all legal, and then in 31 days he rides back out here with a clean note, and there's no fourth paragraph to save us. You didn't beat the debt. You beat the ambush. The debt's still real, and it still comes due, and now we've made an enemy of a man who consolidates land for a living and does not forget being made a fool of by a rancher's wife." He shook his head. "You bought us a season. Maybe, that's all. And you made us a powerful enemy buying it." The joy went out of Margaret slow, but it did not turn to despair because she was past despair. Now she'd been past it since the midnight at the ledger table, and instead it turned to something harder and better. "A season," she said. "A season is all I asked for. A season is the good year." She wiped her face and stood up straight out of his arms, and she was the woman doing sums again. "Listen to me. If they have to give proper notice 30 days and then still can't foreclose until the note actually comes due in the fall, then we have exactly the window we planned for. We have the summer and we have the fall drive. If we bring the herd to the railhead and sell at the right time at the high price, the way I found in the numbers, we clear enough to pay the note in full when it comes due, and a note paid in full is a note that no Harlan Voss and no trust on God's earth can do one single thing about. They can't consolidate land you've paid for free and clear. The only way they get this ranch is if we come up short in the fall, so we don't come up short." She took his hands. "We make the drive. We make it perfect. We sell high. We pay the note to the dollar. And we watch Harlan Voss eat every threat he made in this yard. That's the answer. That's the whole answer. It was always the drive. Everything comes down to the fall drive." And so the summer became a single held breath. All of it bent toward one thing: the fall drive to the railhead at Cheyenne, the sale that would pay the note and save the ranch, or come up short and lose it. They worked that summer harder than either of them had ever worked. Margaret learned every part of running the cattle now, not because she couldn't stay indoors, but because there was no one else and everything depended on it. And she and Caleb became, over those hot months, a thing more than a married couple. They became partners in the old hard sense of the word, the sense Jed and Caleb had been before the river took Jed, two people carrying one weight between them, each trusting the other's end to hold. But the country was not done. It had one more thing to throw, and it threw it in September, 3 weeks before the drive. And it was the worst thing yet, because it was not aimed at the ranch or the money at all. It was aimed at Caleb. He was thrown from a green horse. It was a stupid thing, A nothing thing. The kind of thing that happens on a ranch 100 times without harm. A horse spooked at a rattler in the sage, and came down wrong and rolled, and Caleb went off, and the horse came over on his leg, and Margaret 300 yards off. At the tank, heard the scream, the horse's scream, and then her husband's, and she was on her own horse and across that ground before she knew she'd moved, and she found him white and sweating in the sage with his lower leg bent, in a way a leg does not bend, broken badly the bone near through the skin, 3 weeks before the drive that had to happen, that could not happen without him, that she did not know how to make happen alone. And this time there was no lamp to light and no note to read. This time there was just a broken man in the sage, and a drive that had to go, and a wife who had to decide in the space of a held breath whether the road they'd been walking since February ended here in the dirt. She got him home. She would never afterward be entirely able to say how one woman got a big man with a shattered leg up onto a horse and walked that horse 3 miles home holding him in the saddle, but she did it the way she'd done every impossible thing since she got off the train, by refusing the alternative. She got him home, and she set the leg following his own gasped instructions, because there was no doctor closer than Cheyenne, and no time to fetch one. She pulled the bone back true, while he screamed and near passed out, and gripped the bed frame till the wood cracked, and she splinted it tight. And when it was done, and he lay gray and shaking, and the worst was past, he looked up at her and said the thing. They were both thinking, the thing neither of them had said the whole ride home. "The drive," he said. "Margaret, the drive's in 3 weeks. I can't ride. I can't sit a horse for 2 months, not with this, not even close. And a drive to Cheyenne is 3 days of hard riding with 300 head, and it takes men, and we've no money to hire men. That was the whole trap, and I can't—" His voice broke. "I can't do it. I can't make the drive. And if we don't make the drive, we don't sell. And if we don't sell, we don't pay the note, and Voss gets the ranch after all, and there was nothing wrong with your plan. Margaret, your plan was perfect. It was only ever going to fail if I broke, and I broke. A horse and a rattlesnake, and I broke, and I've lost us everything, the same as if I'd signed Voss's paper in July." He turned his face away, and Margaret saw a thing more terrible to her than the bone through the skin had been. She saw Caleb Morgan give up. "It's over. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. You married a man who couldn't keep his own ranch through one bad turn of luck." And Margaret Morgan looked at her husband, gray and broken and defeated in the bed she'd nursed him back to life in once already, and she felt something rise up in her that she recognized, because it was the same thing that had risen up in the storm, and in the doctor's office, and in the yard with Harlan Voss. The thing that had been rising up in her all her difficult life, every single time a man or a mother or a whole city told her that a woman couldn't, that she was too much, that she should be less, that she should sit down and be quiet and let the world happen to her. "No," she said. He turned back to look at her. "No, it is not over, and no, you did not lose us everything, and you will not lie there and give it away with your own mouth while I'm standing here." Her voice was shaking, but it was not weak. It was the opposite of weak. It was the voice of a woman who had run out of patience with the word can't. "You can't make the drive. All right. That's true. That's the one true thing you've said. You cannot sit a horse for 3 days with that leg. Fine. So you won't." She leaned down over the bed. "I will." Caleb stared at her. "Margaret, I have driven this ranch alone for 2 weeks in the dead of winter. I have pulled calves alone and shut gates alone in storms. And I have read a land shark off our porch with his own note. I know the route to Cheyenne. You've drawn it for me a dozen times. I know where the water is and where the bad crossings are. I know the whole of it, because I could never once stay indoors and be a guest, and you thought that was stubbornness, and it was. But this is what the stubbornness was for. This is the day it was always for." She was crying now, and her voice did not waver 1 inch. "I will make the drive. I will take our 300 head to the railhead at Cheyenne, and I will sell them at the high price the way I found in the numbers, and I will pay Harlan Voss's note to the dollar, and I will come home to you with a clear title in my hand, and you will lie in that bed and mend your leg, and let me do you hear me, Caleb Morgan, you will lie there and let your wife save your ranch, because that is what a partner is. That is the whole of what a partner is. And you told me yourself you never once got to set this place down and have somebody carry the other end, and well, this is me carrying it. The whole thing. For 3 days. So you can mend. Now you are going to teach me everything you know about driving cattle from this bed every night for 3 weeks, and then I am going to go do it. And I am not asking your permission. I am telling you how it's going to be. The room was silent, and Caleb Morgan looked up at his wife, this Boston woman he'd advertised for on a whim and gotten by the grace of God, this woman who had gotten off a train and looked at him with despair and stayed anyway and learned his whole hard country and beaten a storm and a lung and a land shark, and was now with him broken in the bed proposing to drive 300 head of cattle 60 miles through the wilderness alone to save the land he'd bled for 11 years. And the thing that came into his face was not fear anymore, and it was not the giving up, and it was not even the sunrise over the seabed she'd seen so many times. It was awe. Plain, total, undefended awe. The awe of a man looking at the one true miracle of his whole hard life. And his eyes ran over, and he did not try to stop them. And he reached up and took her face in his 2 hands, the way he had the morning after the storm. And he said in a voice with nothing left in it but love and wonder, "I put 4 lines in the paper. Rancher seeks a wife who can think." He shook his head slow, the tears running into his beard. "Margaret, I asked for a wife who could think, and God sent me a woman who could do anything. Anything at all. I don't deserve it. No man alive deserves it. But I'll not insult you by refusing it. Not you, not ever again. You want to drive our cattle to Cheyenne? Then by God you'll drive them, and you'll do it better than I ever did, and I'll lie here and mend and be the proudest broken man in the whole territory." He pulled her down and pressed his forehead to hers. "Teach you everything I know. 3 weeks, every night. And then you go, and you sell high, and you come home to me. You come home to me, Margaret. That's the only part of the plan I'll hold you to. Everything else you'll do better than I could dream. But you come home." "I'll come home," she said against his forehead. "I have crossed 2,000 miles to get to you once already. 60 back from Cheyenne is nothing. I'll come home." And so began the strangest 3 weeks of the strangest year of Margaret Morgan's life. 3 weeks in which a broken man taught his wife from a sickbed by lamplight everything. 11 hard years had taught him about moving cattle across a wild country, how to read the lead steer and let the herd string out and never push them into water. They feared how to bed them down at night and stand the watches, how to handle a stampede if the worst came, which he prayed it wouldn't, how to find the crossings and read the weather and talk to the buyers at the railhead so they didn't cheat a woman alone. Everything poured out of him into her, night after night with a desperate thoroughness. And Margaret took it all in, the way she'd taken in everything since Boston, hungrily, completely, because she had always been able to learn anything that had never been her trouble. Her trouble had only ever been finding a single soul who'd let her. And on a cold, bright morning in the first week of October, Margaret Morgan rode out of the ranch yard at the head of 300 head of cattle, alone with the route to Cheyenne in her memory, and her husband's whole, hard-won knowledge in her head, and the fate of everything they'd built and everything they owed riding on. Whether a Boston woman who'd been called too difficult to marry could do the one thing her entire difficult life had somehow impossibly prepared her for. And Caleb Morgan dragged himself to the window on his splinted leg and watched her go. Watched his wife and his cattle and his whole future string out across the seabed country toward the far railhead. And he stayed at that window long after she'd gone from sight. And then he did the only thing left to a broken man who'd handed his whole life to the woman he'd married by mail, the thing she'd taught him without ever meaning to, kneeling by a lamp in a window in a storm the winter before. He prayed, and he lit a lamp, and he set it in the window, though it was morning, and she was 3 days' ride from needing it, because he could not just sit and do nothing, and a lamp in a window was the one thing he knew how to do, to say to a person out in that country, "Come home, come home. I'm here, come home." The first day of the drive went well, and Margaret should have known better than to trust it, because the country never let you have a good day without a price. She moved the herd out onto the seabed country in the cold, bright morning, and they strung out for her the way Caleb had said they would, the lead steer settling into the route like he'd walked it before, which he had, and Margaret rode the point the way her husband had taught her from his sickbed, easy, never pushing, letting the herd find its own pace. And by noon of that first day, she had begun cautiously to believe she could do this. She made 12 miles that day. She bedded the herd down at the first water exactly where Caleb had drawn it on the map he'd made her memorize, and she stood the night watches alone, circling the sleeping cattle in the dark, and singing to them low the way he'd told her to, because cattle spook at silence and settle to a voice. And she sang every hymn she knew. And then Whitman half remembered made into a tune, because it was the only other thing she had, and the herd stayed down and quiet under the stars. And she thought, near dawn, exhausted, saddle sore alone in the vast dark, that she had never once in her whole Boston life felt so entirely herself. The second day the weather turned. She smelled it before she saw it the way Caleb had taught her. A wrongness in the air, a shift in how the cattle moved. And she looked north to where the hawks came from, and saw the sky going the color of a bruise, and her stomach dropped because she knew that sky. She'd learned that sky the hard way, the winter before, standing at a window keeping a lamp lit while it tried to kill her husband. An early storm. The first of the season weeks ahead, of when it had any right to come, and her with 300 head strung out across open country, a full day from the railhead, and no cabin, no shelter, no Caleb, nothing between her and the whole force of the northern sky, but her own 2 hands, and everything he'd poured into her head, across 3 weeks of lamplit nights. And she heard his voice clear, as if he rode beside her. If the worst comes, and a storm comes down on you on open ground, you do not run from it. Margaret, you cannot outrun weather with a herd. You'll only scatter them and lose half to the drifts. You bunch them. You push them together tight in the lowest ground you can find, and you keep them bunched, and you keep them moving slow in a circle, so they don't smother the ones on the inside, and you get down off the wind side of them, and you use their own bodies for a wall. 300 head of cattle put out heat like a furnace. They'll keep each other alive, and they'll keep you alive too, if you've the nerve to stay in among them. It's the ones who panic and run that die. The country doesn't kill the ones who stay. Remember that. It kills the ones who run. She did not run. The storm came down on her in the middle of the afternoon and turned the world to the roaring white she knew, and Margaret Morgan did the hardest and bravest thing of her whole hard, brave year. She rode into the teeth of it and bunched 300 terrified cattle into the lowest ground she could find, working the green horse back and forth along the edge of the herd, turning the ones who tried to bolt, shouting herself hoarse into a wind that tore the words away. And when a big steer broke and ran, she went after him alone into the white, and turned him, and brought him back, rather than lose one single head, because every head was money, and the money was the note, and the note was the ranch, and the ranch was Caleb, and she would not lose one. She would not. And she got them bunched, and she got them circling slow, and she got down off the wind side of them among their steaming bodies, with her face pressed to the flank of a warm animal, and she stayed. She stayed there all night. In the killing cold, in the roaring dark, in among 300 head of cattle, a woman who a year before had never touched a living cow kept herself and the whole herd alive by refusing hour after hour to run. She lost feeling in her hands and then her feet, and she remembered Caleb chafing her feet by the stove, and she made herself move, made herself walk among the cattle, keeping her own blood going, and she talked to them, and she talked to Caleb, though he was 60 miles away. In a bed she talked to him the whole night out loud, into the flank of a steer. I'm not running, do you hear me? I'm doing it just like you said. I've got them bunched. I haven't lost one. I'm coming home to you. I'm coming home. Just hold on and keep your lamp lit, and I'm coming home. And the night went on forever, and then the way even the worst nights do, it ended. Dawn came gray and still and cold, and the storm had blown itself out, and Margaret Morgan lifted her frozen head from the flank of a steer and looked around her at 300 head of cattle standing steaming in the new light alive. Everyone, not a single head lost, and she began to laugh, cracked and hoarse and half frozen, laughing at the pale sky and the seabed country, and the whole hard land that had thrown its worst at her one more time and found her still standing. And she got up on stiff legs, and she got the herd moving because Cheyenne was one day on, and the note was waiting, and she was by God going to make the drive. She came into the railhead at Cheyenne on the evening of the third day. Frozen and filthy and swaying in the saddle at the head of 300 head of cattle, she had brought 60 miles alone through an early blizzard without losing one, and the men at the stockyards came out to watch her come. Because word travels, and word had traveled a woman driving a full herd in alone after that storm. And they lined the rails, and they took off their hats as she brought the cattle in. And Margaret Morgan, who had been called too difficult to marry by the whole of Boston, rode into the Cheyenne railhead, through a corridor of hard frontier men holding their hats to their chests. And she understood that she had done a thing that even out here, even among men who did hard things every day, was reckoned a thing to take your hat off for. But the drive was only half of it. The other half was the sale, and the sale was where a woman alone could still be beaten, and Margaret knew it. And so did the cattle buyer who came to meet her. A heavy-set man named Pruitt, who had bought Caleb's beef for years, and who looked at the exhausted woman off the trail and saw she could tell exactly what Harlan Voss had first seen hanging wash a woman alone, a woman he could get a price past. He offered her a price. It was a fair-sounding price, and it was, she knew instantly, because she had found the true price in the numbers back in February, a full $1 a head under what the beef was worth at that week's market. And $1 a head across 300 head was $300. And $300 was the difference between paying Voss's note in full and coming up just short. Which was, she understood in a flash of cold clarity. Exactly the point. Exactly how these things were done. You did not have to cheat a rancher badly. You only had to cheat them a little, just enough to leave them a little short, and a little short was all Voss needed. "That's $1 a head light, Mr. Pruitt," Margaret said. Pruitt smiled the way Voss had smiled. "Now, ma'am, I know you've had a hard trail, but the market's the market, and this is a fair." The market at close of business yesterday in Chicago telegraphed to the Cheyenne Exchange, which posts it daily on the board inside that building behind you, was $1.10 a head above what you've just offered me. She kept her voice level and clear and let it carry because there were men listening. "I read the board on my way in. I read boards, Mr. Pruitt. It's a habit of mine. So you'll either meet the posted Chicago price for prime beef, less the fair freight to get it there, which I've also calculated and which comes to 11 cents a head, not $1.10. Or I will pen these cattle here at your competitor's yard across the tracks, who I am told pays the posted price to anyone who can read it, and I can read it. Which will it be?" The stockyard had gone quiet. Pruitt's smile had curdled, and Margaret watched him do the same arithmetic Voss had done, watched him recalculate the woman in front of him. Watched him understand that the exhausted, filthy female off the trail had walked into his yard, knowing the Chicago close and the freight rate to the penny, and that there were 40 hard men leaning on the rails who had just watched her drive a herd in through a blizzard and take off their hats for her, and were now to a man watching to see if he'd cheat her. He paid the posted price, less 11 cents freight, to the penny, and Margaret Morgan stood in the Cheyenne stockyard office and watched the clerk count out the money. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the note paid in full, and money over. Besides, and she took that money and she walked it straight across the street to the office of the Cheyenne Cattlemen's Trust, still filthy, still in her trail clothes, and she asked to see Mr. Harlan Voss, and they showed her in. And Harlan Voss looked up from his desk and saw the rancher's wife. He'd tried to run off a porch in July, standing in his office, covered in the dust of a 60-mile drive, and she watched the recognition, and then the calculation, and then something that was almost fear cross his smooth face. "Mrs. Morgan," he said carefully, "this is unexpected. The Morgan note," she said, "held by the trust, comes due this month. I'm here to pay it. In full." And she set the money on his desk. All of it counted, and she set beside it the note itself, which she'd had the bank produce when she paid stamped paid in full in red ink, because she had thought of that too. She had thought of everything, 3 weeks of lamplit nights and one long 60-mile ride to think of everything. "You'll want to record it. Paid in full this date. The Morgan Ranch is clear. Free and clear every acre, every head. There is no note anymore, Mr. Voss. There is nothing here for the trust to consolidate. There never will be. My husband bled 11 years for that land, and I froze a night in a blizzard among 300 head of cattle to bring you your money, and it's yours, all of it. And now the ranch is ours, and you will never ride into our yard again. She leaned down over his desk, the way she'd leaned over Voss's note in July, the way she'd leaned over a broken man in a bed. You looked at me hanging wash, and you saw a woman you could get a ranch past. I want you to remember every time you ride this country and see our land and can't touch it, that you were beaten by that woman, twice. Good day. And Margaret Morgan walked out of Harlan Voss's office with the ranch paid free and clear, and she got on her horse, though she was near dead with exhaustion, and she did not stay the night in Cheyenne, because there was a man 60 miles out with a broken leg and a lamp in a window, and she had promised him she'd come home. She rode through the night. She should not have. She was exhausted past sense, but she could not stop, not with it done, not with the paper in her coat that said the land was theirs. And she rode through the cold dark, following the route back the way she'd come, and toward dawn. On the fourth day, she came up over the last rise of the seabed country, and saw far off across the pale land, small and gold and steady in the gray. Before sunrise, a single light, a lamp, in a window, burning in the morning when there was no need for it burning the way she'd burned one for him the winter before, because a lamp in a window was the one thing a person out here knew how to do. To say to someone gone into the country, "Come home, I'm here, come home," he'd kept it lit. Every night she was gone, he'd kept a lamp in the window, a broken man dragging himself across the room on a splinted leg to trim the wick and keep the light 4 days and 4 nights, so that whenever she came over that last rise, whatever hour, there would be a light to ride home to. Margaret Morgan put her heels to the tired horse and rode down off the rise toward the light, and she was crying before she reached the yard, and Caleb had heard the hoofbeats and dragged himself to the door, and he stood in the doorway on his crutch with the lamp burning behind him. And she came off the horse before it had fully stopped, and she went to him, and he caught her broken leg, and all he caught her, and they went down together against the doorframe, holding each other, and she got out between sobs, the only words that mattered. "It's done. It's paid. The ranch is ours. Caleb free and clear. I paid Voss to the dollar and watched his face, and I didn't lose one head, not one. I brought them all through the storm. I did everything you taught me. I'm home. I came home. It's ours. It's ours forever. No one can take it. It's ours." And Caleb Morgan held his wife in the doorway with the morning coming up over the seabed hills and the lamp still burning behind them, and he could not speak. He could only hold her, this woman he'd advertised for in 4 lines of a paper, and gotten by the pure grace of God, this woman who had gotten off a train and looked at him with despair, and stayed, who had learned his whole hard country, and beaten a storm, and a lung, and a land shark, and a blizzard, and a cheating buyer, and a man who consolidated land for a living, who had done in 1 year every single thing the country had thrown at them, and had done it at the end alone to bring him home, a clear title, and herself alive. And he held her, and he wept into her filthy, trail-worn hair, and the only thing he could finally say was her name over and over, Margaret. Margaret, Margaret, like it was the only word he had left, and the truest one he'd ever learned. That was the year that made them. Everything after was built on it. The leg mended, the ranch clear of debt at last, and run now by 2 minds instead of 1 by a cattleman who knew the land in his bones, and a woman who knew the numbers in her blood, began to do what it had never been able to do under debt and loneliness. It thrived. Margaret found the true price for the beef every year, now sold at the high mark, timed the market, the way her father had taught her without ever knowing what he was teaching. Caleb ran the stock and read the land, and the 2 of them argued at the plank table every night of their lives about cattle and prices and Rome and Whitman and railroad economics and everything under the sun, argued and laughed and leaned in and said, "Say it again. Slow. I want to get it right." And the ranch grew, and the years grew, and the children came. 3 of them in time. And Margaret raised them out on that hard, bright country to know the birds and the seabed and the river that took what it wanted. Raised them to read a board and read the small print and read a note. Raised her daughters to know that a woman's mind was not a thing to be filed down for any man, and raised her son to be the kind of man who, when he found a woman who could think, would lean in over the table and say, "More, tell me more," instead of asking her to be less. And on the winter nights, with the stove going and the lamp in the window out of habit now more than need, she told them the story, all of it, the way the old tell the young the stories that made them. She told them about the letters, about the 4 lines in the paper, "Rancher seeks a wife who can think," and how their grandmother in Boston had thought it a joke and left it on the sideboard, and how it had turned out to be the door to the whole rest of her life. She told them about the 11 letters, and how she'd fallen in love with a mind before she'd ever seen a face. And then she told them always the hardest part, the part she never softened, because it was the part that mattered most. She told them about the train station. She told them how she'd gotten off the westbound at Cheyenne, expecting the man from a 10-year-old photograph, clean and combed and handsome, and how she'd seen instead a rough man in a torn coat with a month of beard eating out of a paper sack with his fingers, and how her heart had sunk, and how she'd dropped her suitcase in the snow and said out loud to no one that she had made the worst mistake of her life. And had you? A child would always ask, though they always knew they'd heard it 100 times, and they still asked because they loved the answer. "I had made the worst mistake of my life," Margaret would say, "but not the one I thought. The mistake wasn't marrying him. The mistake was looking at a man for one single minute and believing I knew him. I looked at a torn coat, and I thought I'd read the whole book. And the whole book, children, the whole book was the finest man I ever knew or ever will. And I nearly turned around and got back on the train and missed the entire thing. Missed my whole life, missed all of you because of what a coat looked like on a cold morning." She would take their faces in her old calloused hands, the hands that had turned from soft Boston hands to a rancher's hands over one hard winter. "So hear me. Hear your mother. Never once in your lives trust your first impression of a soul. Never read a person off their coat or their beard or their table manners or 1 minute on a train platform. Those things are the cover. Give it time. Give it a winter. Trust time, not your eyes. Because the person I saw at the train station and the person I married are the same man, and I was wrong about him for exactly 1 minute, and it was very nearly the most expensive minute of my life." And the child would say, "But you weren't. You stayed." "I stayed," Margaret would say. "I very nearly didn't. But I stayed, and I learned him, and learning him was the work of my whole life, and the joy of it. And that man in the torn coat who I pitied for 1 minute on a train platform turned out to be the one person on this earth who never once, not one single time in all our years, asked me to be smaller than I was. Do you understand what that is worth? 2 men in Boston left me at the altar for being too much, and your father, who I nearly fled from over a coat, spent his whole life leaning across a table saying, 'Say it again, I want to get it right.' That is the man I almost missed. That is what a first impression almost cost me. Caleb Morgan lived a long life on that land, and when he was old and gray and his cough finally came back for good. One winter, Margaret nursed him the way she had that first year, and she sat up with him. The last nights, the way she'd once sat up keeping a lamp lit, and she was holding his hand at the end, and the last thing he said to her, in the ruin of the voice that had once argued her about Whitman till the fire died, was, "I saw the lamp." The same words he'd said on the floor the night of the first storm, the night she'd hauled him out of the white and warmed him back to life with her own body. "I saw the lamp," meaning thank you, meaning you were there, meaning of course you were. You were always there from the platform to the storm, to the blizzard, to this last bed. You were always the light I rode home to. And Margaret held his hand and put her forehead to his, the way they'd done 10,000 times, and said, "There now, my dear. There now. I've got you. Go on now. I'll keep the lamp lit." And he went warm, held home, and she kept the lamp lit in the window that night, and every night after, until her own end came years on the same land, in the same house with her children and her grandchildren around her, and the seabed hills going gold outside the window. They buried her on the hill above the house beside Caleb, beside Ruth, beside Jed in the bright, hard country she had crossed 2,000 miles to reach, and had come over one impossible year to love more than the city that had never wanted her exactly as she was. And on her stone, at her own instruction given years before, to the child who would outlive her, they carved no dates of triumph and no list of all she'd done, not the storm she'd survived, nor the herd she'd driven, nor the land shark she'd beaten with the 4th paragraph, nor the blizzard she'd stood alone. They carved only the 8 words she'd said 10,000 times to her children and her children's children. The 8 words that were the whole of what a difficult woman from Boston had learned on a train platform in the cold, and spent a lifetime trying to give away. Never trust your eyes. Give it time. Trust time. She had married a stranger by letters. She had met him at a train station, and for one single minute regretted every word she'd ever written him. And that minute, that one wrong minute, judging a whole man by a torn coat, was the closest Margaret Hale ever came to losing the only thing that ever truly belonged to her. She did not lose it. She stayed. She learned him. She loved him. And she spent the rest of her long life certain of one thing above all others, certain enough to carve it in stone. The man she saw at the train station was never the man she married because she had not yet learned to see, and the day she learned to see was the day her real life began. She had not made the worst mistake of her life that cold morning in Cheyenne. She had made the best decision she would ever make, and simply mistaken it for one single minute for the worst. And she was grateful every single day of the 50 years that followed, that she'd had the courage to stay long enough to find out how wrong she'd been.